Chapter 31. Jarek's mind was a screaming torrent of long shots and hopeless prayers as he loped painfully along beside Drogon. He'd been more than a little skeptical about Operation Enochian's super soldier since Rachel had first explained it to him by comm a few weeks ago. But he'd trusted Rachel when she'd told him she believed it was their best hope at gaining a surprise advantage. He'd even started to believe himself once he'd seen the changes Halden and Elise had gone through. And now the Rakul were here in force, literally pounding down their front door, and the Enochians simply perished? Teach me to ever get my hopes up again, Jarek muttered. As I tried to explain to Rachel Cross, Drogon said, not breaking stride, it is possible that this is part of the process. Possible or likely? Drogon hesitated. Possible. Great. Real helpful. There is hardly adequate precedent by which to judge, Drogon growled as they barreled into the tunnel Jarek was pretty sure was the right one. Snippy. Apparently Jarek wasn't the only one who'd been starting to hope. And he certainly wasn't the only one who was on the verge of losing it. The feel inside the Enochians' barracks was one of rampant panic. Jarek had heard the thuds before they reached the door. As he stepped in, he saw that Rachel was pounding on Halden's chest, and Franco was similarly applying rhythmic compressions to Elise's. At the sound of their entrance, Johnny and Phineas whipped around and trained weapons on them, their eyes shocked and frantic behind the sights of their rifles. Jarek spread his hands and they lowered the weapons, looking no less panicked. It wasn't the threat of intruders they feared right now. Rachel and Franco hadn't looked up, hadn't noticed them at all, occupied as they were. Rach, Jarek said softly, sliding in behind her. She kept at it, rolled her shoulder out from under his hand when he touched her. Jarek looked back at Drogon, who was leaned over Elise, inspecting her closely. Franco broke away from his compressions to shoot a desperate look at Drogon. Will compressions help? Jarek asked the Rachnoth. I do not know. Jarek stared dumbly at Drogon for a moment, then turned and gently shouldered in past Rachel. Here, let me. She fought for a second, then scooted aside and leaned against the wall with a heavy sigh. Behind him, Jarek heard Drogon similarly take over for Franco, though Franco didn't collapse to rest, just hovered there, frozen in shock and horror. For a long stretch, no one said anything, and there was nothing but the rhythmic groans of protest from the pair of cots and the sounds of distant tumult out in the tunnels. Halden's chest gave about as readily as steel plating. It was a wonder Rachel hadn't broken her fists pounding on it like she had been. Maybe she had. What's our next step? Jarek forced himself to ask as he worked, trying to keep his voice level, confident. We've got 3 at the front entrance, already past the first door. We've got at least 2 more outside, probably more than that. He paused to see if anyone would add their input. They didn't. Not until Drogon spoke up. I am in communication with my kin. They believe they are converging on the last of Kul Vermaga's insurgents. Our allies have restrained the others afflicted, and the people of the complex are busy at work restoring the essential systems. We gotta do something, Jarek said. I have a feeling that door is not gonna hold for long. He looked at Rachel, trying to catch her eye. She was too busy staring at the floor, dejected. You said there's a back door, right? He asked. A private lift? Rachel closed her eyes, seemed to pull herself back from somewhere far away, then met his gaze, somber but resolute, and nodded. You want to go out there? Johnny asked. That is madness, Drogon agreed. Madder than waiting to face down a giant wolf, a roid-raging gargoyle, and the praying mantis from hell in an enclosed tunnel? Jarek shot back. God knows who else is about to join the party. Gotta can't be far behind. Perhaps you have a point, Drogon said. It's not like we're going to be able to work the funnel angle in here, not against them. But we've got the agility. You have a hole in your leg, Drogon said. You've got the agility then, and the rest of your kin too. At least out there you can use it. We go up. We get to open ground, lead them south. Maybe we even give our bystanders a chance to slip out the north portal." "And what about my daughter?" Franco asked, his tone so flat and lifeless Jarek couldn't help but wince. Drogon gave Elise another 3 compressions before answering, slowly. "If this state is an intended part of the process." He seemed to rethink his words with uncharacteristic restraint. "Albraka and Shieth Lietha would not have deliberately ended the process without a plan. If it was unintentional, even if Halden Raish, Elise Fields, and my kin yet live in some capacity, I do not believe there is anything in our power left to do for them." Jarek glanced back and immediately wanted to turn away from the raw, shocked pain radiating from Franco's pale face. He looked like he couldn't remember how to breathe, like a father who just realized he'd lost his daughter, for good this time. Drogon had stopped applying compressions. Jarek realized with a tinge of guilt that he'd stopped compressing Halden's chest as well, almost without thinking about it. Rachel looked for a second like she wanted to argue, but she couldn't. The 2 Enochians were cold, pale, utterly still. Whatever had happened, if there was still any flicker of life in there, it was up to them now. But every moment they sat here was one less moment to do something before a squadron of Rakul burst into the complex and annihilated what few of them were left to resist. So Jarek forced himself to stand, suppressing a wince of pain, and offered Rachel a hand. She took it and rose nearly as stiffly as he had. What do we do with them?" Johnny asked softly. He stumbled back and dropped heavily onto a storage crate, looking as dejected as Franco, his empty gaze locked on Halden. "We can't leave them here." "No," whispered Franco quickly, desperately. Then more loudly, "No, we take them with us." Drogon wordlessly began to scoop Elise up, but Phineas stepped in and bade him move with a stoic stare. Drogon stepped respectfully back to allow him room. Judging from what he'd felt of Halden's build and what he knew of the density of the average Rachnoth, Jarek was guessing Elise, who'd already been tall and built like a warrior, must weigh nearly 300 pounds now, if not more. Phineas didn't complain, though, just hefted her laboriously up across his beefy shoulders with a little help from Franco, stumbled once, then stood waiting, resolute and ready to move. Right then. Jarek glanced at Johnny, seeing if the Enochian had any ambition to try to do the same with Halden. He probably would have liked to, but he seemed to understand it wasn't physically feasible, especially loaded with weapons and gear as he was. So Jarek scooped Halden up over his armored shoulder and turned for the door. His guess about Elise had probably been close enough. At a rough estimate, Halden weighed a good 350 pounds. It should have been bizarre, but Jarek was getting used enough to dealing with Rachnoth by now. The much more important question was where they were headed and exactly what they were going to do when they got there. Everyone in the room seemed to be waiting for something. Probably a miracle. If only. Being about 2.5 decades out of practice in garnering divine intervention credits, Jarek resigned himself to giving them a verbal prod instead. "To the lift, then," he said, trying to sound confident about it. "You want to lead the way?" he added to Drogon. No one argued. They set off quietly, dark stone tunnels dancing beneath the bouncing streams of their lights as they went. Rachel stayed at Jarek's side, though they didn't speak. The tunnels echoed with shouts and the sounds of soldiers and complex civilians rushing about the underground network, but there were no sounds of fighting for now. They passed a group who was on their way to help restart the generators. At the next intersection, they found Al Brandt waiting for them. And not just Brandt, Jarek realized as he approached the intersection. Alaric was there too, along with a small squad of troops that included Michael, Chambers, and Leah. Eyes fell on the limp forms draped over Jarek's and Phineas's shoulders. Michael and Rachel shared a quick hug, and Leah moved to Johnny's side, but no one saw fit to break the grim silence. They fell in together and continued on. Brant and Alaric seemed to know where they were headed, probably having already had the news from Drogon. When they reached the command center a few minutes later, it wasn't the flurry of activity Jarek had been expecting. Sure, the few complex personnel darting around trying to get their equipment back online seethed plenty of frantic energy to go around. But the rest of the crowd, the few dozen armed men and women gathered in the room and throughout the surrounding hallways, were simply waiting. Some in terror, some with hard determination in their eyes, plenty in clear shock. There was a rustle of weapons being aimed at them as they came into view, and then lowered again as they drew close enough to the assembled forces to be recognized. There were a few hopeful murmurs from the command center crowd at the sight of the reinforcements. Panicked whispers joined the mix as they got a better look at the dead weights Jarek and Phineas carried. Jarek wasn't even sure whether the majority of their forces had known about the hopeful plan to grow themselves a pair of Enochian secret weapons. Either way, the cloud hanging over their group must have made it clear enough that shit had gone awry, to say the least. "This way," Drogon said, pushing on through the corridor of armed soldiers. No one gave half a thought to stopping them, though several looked like they wanted to ask what the hell was happening and what they were going to do about it. They pushed on into the command room, following Drogon as he began to angle them toward the next hallway over, where Dola's private office and backdoor lift must have been situated. Commander Nelkin hobbled his way over to them, his already grim expression falling as he took in the sight of Halden and Elise. His eyes burned a question at Jarek. Jarek gave a slight shake of his head, not wanting to say anything that would call attention to the significant setback. The crowd's silent tension broke anyway.
"What's happening out there?"
someone shouted. "What happened to those two?" another voice added. Jarek turned in the speaker's general direction, though it was hard to tell exactly who'd spoken in the patchwork light of the command room. He looked to Nelkin, whose face was drawn tight, his eyes distant. He looked to Alaric, who was watching Jarek silently, his eyes not so much expectant as just clocked out. Detached. Neither one of them was going to say a thing. "What are we going to do?" someone shouted. The question and several more like it were spreading through the ranks with growing restlessness. They had to move. That door wasn't going to last forever. Jarek looked at Rachel. She gave a subtle nod and tilted her head toward the discontented crowd. Jarek drew a deep breath. The door wasn't going to last forever, but they also couldn't just parade off to fight and expect their people to be ready to move either. "Listen up, folks," Jarek called. They quieted, waiting. He didn't even need to amplify his voice with Phila's speakers. "You know what's out there, what's coming for us." He shook his head. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We're in a tight spot here, but we're not dead yet." Jarek hardly needed the uneasy sounds rippling through the crowd to know it wasn't his best work. "We're all gonna die," someone whimpered nearby. A bigger guy, hunkered down against one of the consoles, rocking back and forth with knees to chest, head buried. Yep, definitely not his best work. Shit. Jarek started to unload Halden from his shoulder, intending to set the Enochian down for a second. Instead, Drogon stepped in and smoothly accepted Halden's weight without a word. Several 100 pounds lighter, Jarek turned and crouched down in front of the big, cowering soldier. The crowd watched with bated breath as if waiting for another one of those miracles. Jarek still didn't have one. "Come on, guy," he said. "Are you dead yet?" "No, but the... Jarek was louder this time. "Are you dead yet, soldier?" He felt ridiculous saying it, but at least the big guy lifted his head. No. Jarek grabbed him by the utility vest, yanked him smoothly to his feet, and proceeded to make a point of smoothing out the guy's shirt and gear. "Goddamn right you're not!" He clapped him on the shoulder. "You down for holding your shit together until we get through this?" The guy just stared at him for a second. Then he bobbed his head emphatically. Yes, sir." Again with the "sir" thing. He was just wondering how to react and keep the good momentum rolling when the light snapped on throughout the room and nearby hallways, and a round of cheers spread through the crowd. Back in business. "See?" Jarek called, looking around. "All peaches from here. Isn't that right, folks?" There were tentative sounds of agreement. Then Rachel cried, "Hell yes, sir!" And the crowd latched onto the call with an excited energy. "Carpe diem," Michael cried. "Seize that goddamn carp," Chambers added. Rachel shot Jarek a wink, a hint of amusement creeping past the grimness that had hung over her since the barracks. Despite everything, Jarek couldn't help but smile. "Good." He bobbed his head appreciatively, looking around the room. "Good. Now who here can organize an evacuation?" No one said anything right away, but several fingers pointed to a short brunette woman. The sleeves of her overalls were rolled up, and she was busy tapping and clicking away at one of the room's computer stations. Busy enough that she didn't notice all the pointing fingers. Not until she felt the entire room's attention on her, and turned to take it in with wide eyes. She looked mortified. "I can't. How are we—" She gathered herself and dropped her abashed look for a highly skeptical one. "An evacuation to where, exactly? Last I checked, we're kind of stuck here." "We're working on it," Jarek said. "You just make sure every non-combatant we have is ready to bail post-haste once the entrance tunnel is clear. Escorts, vehicles, the whole deal. You got it?" She hesitated, glancing from her console to the hallway he was pretty sure led to Dola's office. "Do it, Mel," someone called from the hallway. A second later, Dola appeared in the entranceway to a round of uncertain murmurs among his people. "And whatever your plan is," Dola added to Jarek, "I'm told we should hurry." Drogon gave Jarek a meaningful nod as if he'd received similar word. Word from Krogoth? Either way, they needed to move before the Rakul managed to bust that door down. "Right." Jarek pointed up and in what he was pretty sure was the direction of the south portal. "We're gonna go out there and we're gonna give those giant bastards something a lot more interesting than a big door to play with." "How?" someone called. "I have a way," Dola provided. "And you'll all have a way too, once we get out there." Jarek pushed on before Dola's people could dwell on what else their esteemed leader had been hiding from them. "We'll draw them to the south portal and keep them there long enough for you to slip out." "And what are you going to do after that?" asked the elected coordinator, Mel. Jarek looked to Rachel and Drogon. They nodded, resolute. "Well," he said back to Mel, "I was kinda thinking we'd just see if we can't kill the whole damn lot of them while we're at it." Heavy silence fell on the room as everyone considered what that would almost certainly mean. He couldn't let it settle. "Let's move, people!" he barked, starting for Dola's hallway with an authority that felt a little too easy. Arrogant, even. But they didn't have time for him to worry about playing nice. All that mattered was that neither Dola, the commanders, nor any of the other Rachnoth who trickled in took verbal issue with his authority. Not until their small group had packed into Dola's office, at least. "That's your plan?" Dola hissed. "Sacrifice yourselves on the off chance you might buy 100 people the chance to run for a few more days? A few weeks at best? You got a better plan?" Jarek asked. Dola said nothing. "I'm not sacrificing shit, Mr. Mayor," he pushed on. "I meant what I said back there." Dola sneered. "Oh, yes, that you're all just going to turn around and smite down the Rakul you've been fleeing for the past month?" Jarek held his gaze, refusing to let the uncertainty creep onto his face. He was just about to tell Dola that, yes, that was indeed the plan, when the door swung open and Krogoth strode in, followed shortly by a few more Rachnoth, Zack, and a few of his men.
"Rid yourself of that smirk, Nan,"
Krogoth growled.
"It reeks of your pathetic fear. We are beyond the point of talking. Jarek Slater has chosen the only honorable option left to us. Now reveal this lift of yours."
"Yeah, Nan," Jarek said, trying and failing to suppress a morbidly amused grin. What Krogoth said In truth, honor had been just about the last thing on Jarek's mind since the attack began, or pretty much any time before that. It was more just that, in his eyes, this was the only real choice left to them at all, honorable or no. Running wasn't happening. Not for all of them, at least. The Rakul would never let them escape now. And fighting the ferocious creatures in the confines of the complex didn't feel particularly advantageous. They might as well face the Rakul on their own terms, kill as many of the bastards as they could, and give the others a chance at slipping out while they were at it. And hell, he thought, looking at Halden's limp body and Drogon's arms, maybe by some minor miracle they'd even managed to win without their super weapons. 3 Kull were already dead, as far as he knew. And judging by the thankful lack of giant space dragons thus far, he was pretty sure not all of the remaining 9 were actually here yet. Definitely not here at the complex. And maybe not even here on Earth, for all they knew. It was a start. Dola tapped at his comm, looking none too happy about it, and a section of the wall in the corner of the room glid smoothly up. "So, we all going up?" Johnny asked. His eyes were hard, his tone lacking his usual humor. "Yeah," Michael said. "Hell yeah," Chambers added. Beside them, Leah nodded with a determined fire in her eyes. "No," Alaric said, lowering his finger from his earpiece. He pointed at Leah. "Commander Daniels needs your help interfacing our forces with our hosts." His finger drifted toward Michael and Chambers. "And you two are with me." Everyone made to protest, but Alaric silenced them all with a look. "We all have jobs to do. We'll be more useful down here." "Doing what, though?" Michael asked. "Price needs our help with something." A feral grin pulled at Jarek's mouth. "BFG related?" Alaric nodded and turned for the door without ceremony. "Good luck out there." "Got it!" One of Zach's men called out of the blue, triumphantly lofting a small tablet. Alaric paused. Zach snatched the tablet and waved them all in. "We've got eyes outside." They crowded around the tablet for a look. Harga, Shimo, and Ogren were still in the entrance antechamber, taking turns on the second security door, which didn't look long for this world. Zach swiped through the camera feeds, and they spotted Vermaga undulating down the mountainside near the north portal. Zach flicked to an east-facing camera that looked out over the expansive parking lot by the north portal. He zoomed to the dark blip of an approaching ship. The vessel might have been 3 miles out, or 30, depending on its size. The shape that fell from the craft a second later, though, somehow left little doubt that it leaned toward the enormous side. The falling creature was a Kull, no doubt about that. At a brief glance, it reminded Jarek somewhat of a woolly mammoth. A woolly mammoth that must have stood nearly 10 stories tall, that was, with glowing red eyes and a horned snout that might have looked more at home on an island-sized rhinoceros. On the tablet display, the Kull hit the earth in an explosion of rock and soil and moved seamlessly into a loping charge for the mountain. "I swear I just felt that," Johnny muttered. Jarek knew what he meant, though he was sure he must have imagined the soft shudder in the earth. "What the fuck is that thing?" Zach asked. Jarek blew out a delirious laugh. "What? You've never seen a goddamn space mammoth before?" "It is Kulmada," Drogon supplied. Zach stared between them, mouth ajar. "And you still want to go out there?" Hell no. Jarek wanted to go find a bigger, more secure mountain to hide under. But instead he just shrugged. "All the more reason now. Do you want to wait and see whether that big fella can knock a mountain down on our heads?" "Fuck," Zach said, after a long moment's consideration. It was time. No more avoiding it. Himself, Rachel, 9 Rachnoth, the Enochians, and Dola and his men if they so chose to come along. Jarek looked over at Alaric. "I think we're going to be needing that BFG, cowboy." Alaric almost looked amused for a second. "Looks that way." He started to turn. hesitated, looked back to meet Jarek's eyes. "Don't go getting stupid out there, son." The words hit him harder than he rightly understood at first. Maybe it was just nice to know Alaric still cared. Or maybe it was that Alaric had used the word Jarek only then realized he'd avoided in their last talk. Son. Guilt filled him, an image of Mosen flashing to mind. Guilt and the determination to make sure Alaric's true son's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. To do better than he had last time, back at the farmhouse. He couldn't find the right words, so he just nodded. Alaric turned for the door, looking satisfied. "All right, folks," Jarek said, clapping his hands together with anxious determination. "Plans is plans. Let's go kill us some Rakul." Dola watched him approach from the corner by the lift, his expression incredulous, pleading. "We cannot win," he said quietly, though every Rachnoth in the room would hear anyway. The humorless smile that split Jarek's face must have been packing a fair touch of craziness to boot, judging by Dola's reaction. "Welcome to Team Earth, buddy," Jarek said, clapping Dola on the shoulder as he passed to head for the lift. "We've been winning fights we couldn't since before my balls dropped." Chapter 32. "Okay," Jarek admitted with a begrudging nod. "That is one fucking gigantic space mammoth."
I have seen bigger,
Drogon murmured behind him. Jarek turned to Rachel beside him and shared a moment's amusement before turning back to the inevitability thundering toward them. It had been a quiet lift ride up, the kind that desperately could have used an injection of well-timed elevator music. Instead, they'd had thick, doomed silence. Rachel had held his hand tightly the whole way up. Their half of the party had hoofed it over to the ridge near the south portal while the lift had returned below for the rest of their little last stand army. It was there they stood now, watching. Below, maybe 2 miles away still, Kulmada charged on, each enormous step seeming a physical impossibility, thundering against the earth and spewing explosions of dust and soil into the air. Closer to the mountain, at the southern edge of the wide parking lot, Jarek spotted that shifty little bastard Fraga watching them with an alien smirk. The Kull must have seen Jarek looking, because he gave a creepy wave with one dagger and vanished. "So was there a plan?" Rachel asked, extracting her hand from his and shifting her staff. "Sir," she added, her lip quirking upward. Jarek looked to the approaching ships, 3 of them now, and couldn't help but grin that she was still ribbing him here and now at what was quite possibly the end. It was no wonder she'd managed to weasel her way so thoroughly past every defense he thought the past 15 years had hardwired into him.
Do not stop until they are dead,
Krogoth rumbled behind them before Jarek could think of anything better. No one pointed out the glaringly obvious addendum. Do not stop until they are dead, or we are. Drogon stepped up to the ridge beside Jarek, craning for a look down the bushy mountainside.
The 3 from the main entrance have taken note of our challenge. They will be at the south portal soon.
Lovely, Jarek said quietly. Mata was closing now, the faint vibrations of his steps growing to actual, unmissable tremors. Jarek realized with a huff of bemused exasperation that Fraga had teleported up to ride into battle on his brother's enormous, furry back. A glance back told him their second liftload of fighters would be at their side within the minute, which, as far as he could tell, was also right about when Mada the mammoth would be plowing straight into the mountainside with that enormous horn-like protrusion of his, provided he stayed the course. The big hairy bastard didn't look like he was planning on stopping anytime soon. Jarek drew the whacker, an odd calm filling him, easing the tension from his shoulders. Like they'd already left the hard part behind. Like they'd made their decision, and now all that was left to do was fight the best they knew how. People were depending on them below. He was probably going to die out here today. They all might. And somehow, he felt completely at home. "Who's up for a giant mammoth ride?" he asked, not looking back.
I am with you, Jarek Slater,
Drogon said. "Guess I'd better stick close too if you're still planning on keeping my ass in sight," Rachel added. "Till the sweet, sweet end," Jarek acknowledged. Pun absolutely intended.
We will meet Kulharga and his ilk as they ascend from the south portal,
Krogoth declared as the rest of the Rachnoth wordlessly fell in with him.
I yet have business with that lupine brute.
Jarek nodded. "Kick his hairless ass, Rusty." Krogoth showed his fangs in what might have been a smile. A murderous one, but a smile nonetheless. Off to the left, the Enochians were approaching at a moderate run, along with Zack, several soldiers, and Dola and Brant, who'd had to wait for the second lift up. "Ready to roll, people," Jarek called. The ground was shaking beneath their feet now. Johnny looked skeptically past him to the rapidly closing behemoth causing the minor earthquake. "Yeah, you guys? You handle that." He looked doubtfully at his big rifle, which was still laughably small in the context of Mada's bulk, and back up to Jarek. "We'll cover you?" Thud, thud. Thud, thud. Jarek smiled. "That'll do, Firecrotch." Johnny gave him a kind of casual, "nice knowing you" salute, and Jarek turned to face the oncoming Titan. Mada looked up at them with crimson eyes that looked beady in his enormous head, despite the fact that they were probably each the circumference of a family dinner table. Then the beast let loose a colossal bellow and lowered his horned snout to charge. The Cull's battle cry sounded something like a foghorn, and it hit like a windy slap in the face, hard enough that Rachel actually staggered back half a step. 40 seconds, maybe less. Jarek swallowed. "You guys ever wonder what happens when an unstoppable mammoth meets an immovable? We're not exactly immovable here," Rachel said.
And we shall prove presently that Kulmada is far from unstoppable,
Drogon added, eyes blazing violent crimson. "Man," Jarek muttered, "you guys ruin all the fun." "So, we're, jumping?" Rachel asked, the first notes of real panic slipping into her voice. "Oh yeah," Jarek said, half to her, half to himself. "We're talking tunes blaring, epic slow-motion leap of faith shit right here." 300 yards. Before or after?" Rachel asked. 200 yards. "Wait, what?" "Before or after he hits?" Rachel snapped. Shit. "Stumpy?" 100 yards. Jesus Christ, that thing was enormous. "Stumpy? Why didn't we—"
Brace!
Drogon roared. Jarek slapped the whacker onto his back, scooped Rachel into his arms, and dropped into a stable stance. He'd been in multiple crashes throughout his life. He'd felt the turbulence when Golga's men had shot his ship down with an RPG back in New York. Somehow, even those experiences didn't quite prepare him for the feeling when Mada hit Cheyenne Mountain with a deep boom. Some part of his brain screamed that it didn't make physical sense for hard, rocky ground to move like that. The rest just worked to keep his ass from falling over. The air was full of dust and debris. The sound of crumbling rock seemed to be everywhere, steady as a waterfall. "Holy fuck," Rachel whispered, coughing in his arms as behind them, Johnny and the others chimed in with their own colorful additions. For a second, the world felt still, silence pressing in on them from the thick, dusty air. It was almost peaceful in an end-of-the-world kind of way. Then the stony ridge shuddered beneath their feet with a profoundly deep cracking sound, like a mountain-sized bone snapping. Something roared off to the left. Harga, Jarek thought. and the enormous shape that could have been mistaken for part of the mountain in the debris-laden air began to shift below them, sending ripples of aftershock through the ground. Mada. Backing up. The aftershock intensified, and the ground lurched beneath them with another crack and a low rumble of stone shifting on heavy stone.
Now, Jarek Slater!
Drogon cried, pointing emphatically to the edge of the ridge. Jarek willed his legs to move. This might be the stupidest thing he'd ever do, but they couldn't let that thing have free run of the mountain and their vehicles. And, if the shifting ground underfoot was any indication, he didn't exactly have time to second-guess the decision now anyway. It felt like the entire ridge was about to come down. Drogon was already plunging forward with a wordless bellow. "Shit," Jarek whispered. If Rachel had encouraging words, she kept them to herself. Al didn't. "Tunes blaring, sir." Then Al broke their long-standing rule of minimizing distractions during battle and started blasting Led Zeppelin's Immigrant Song through Fila's speakers loud enough that half the mountain could probably hear. Jarek barked a laugh, the hesitation melting from his limbs. The ridge was most certainly teetering underfoot now. He didn't care. He let the electric energy of that guitar riff flow through him, filling his head with all sorts of ridiculous delusions of grandeur. He kissed Rachel's forehead, securing her in his arms, and slid his faceplate closed with a thought. Epic slow-motion jump time, then. And with that, he darted forward, pumping Fila's powerful legs after Drogon. Ahead, Drogon reached the edge and leapt into the dusty sky with a mighty roar. Jarek wasn't far behind. His brain screamed at him to stop. He centered himself in the music, the pulsing beat, the shrill battle cry. They reached the edge. He jumped. And then they were flying, and he was yelling, a mad, wordless battle cry of his own. Behind, a series of cracks and rumbling crashes announced the crumbling downfall of the ridge they jumped from. Below, the dark shape of Mada's bulk rose up through the dusty air to greet them. Jarek spotted Drogon, peering up with crimson eyes from behind Mada's massive front shoulders. Something wasn't right. That was all Jarek had time to register before he braced for impact, preparing to spring into a wide looping roll so as not to crush Rachel. There was no need. In the last 20 feet, their fall inexplicably slowed as if they were reaching the end of an invisible bungee cord's stretch. And that was why it was nice to have an arcanist around. They touched easily down between Mada's front shoulders, which probably spanned about 50 feet in width, if not more. Massive didn't even begin to describe this thing. Jarek looked around, testing the furry terrain with an armored boot that disappeared like they were standing in a field of overgrown grass. "Kind of anticlimactic, don't you? Shit!" He nearly face-planted with Rachel as the ground, or Mada's back rather, lurched backward with one of Mada's great steps away from the crumbling ridge. Fraga. It hit him like a punch as he staggered upright. That's what had been wrong. The little gremlin had been riding Mada's back. Where had the shifty bastard gone? No sooner did Jarek have the thought than the air popped just behind him and Rachel drew a sharp breath. She jabbed her hand past Jarek's head and there was a low thrum and the irritated snarl of something rocketing away from them. Jarek was about to spin to face the threat when Fraga popped into existence straight ahead, flying toward them, daggers at the ready. Ah! Jarek threw a reflexive high kick before he could think about it. It was an awkward affair, kicking that high with Rachel still in his arms, but his armored foot connected, and Fraga's flight took a violent course correction. Drogon stepped to their side as Jarek set Rachel down. Fraga twisted around and watched them with fiery eyes as he sailed calmly through the air. Then he vanished. Jarek tensed. But Drogon touched his shoulder and pointed to the south portal where Fraga had reappeared beside his emerging brethren. Harga's size didn't seem nearly so intimidating looking down from the back of the colossal mammoth. Can you turn the damn music off, Al? Rachel said. Jarek almost laughed. He'd nearly forgotten it was even playing, absorbed as he was in the jump and the fight that had abruptly followed. Now it did seem like a silly juxtaposition to the collapsing wreckage of Mada's impact and the sight of the Rakul leaping their way up the mountainside toward Krogoth and his Rachnoth. Al killed the music. A deadly silence seemed to press in around them in its absence, despite the roars and gunfire beginning to erupt from the mountain. I thought it was quite cinematic, sir. You done good, buddy. We'll tell them all about it when they decide to make a movie about shit! Jarek staggered forward as Mada took another aggressive step back. He reached over and caught onto Rachel, steadying both of them. Mada lurched again. Was the Kull trying to throw them off? It was hard to tell from their turbulent vantage point as the beast backed out of the mess he'd just made of the mountainside. But Mada's movements seemed unsteady, slightly drunken, as if maybe running headlong into a freaking mountain had actually fazed him. As if maybe he wasn't so unstoppable. Fazed or not, they needed to take Mada down before he could wreak any more havoc or destroy the escape route from the complex. Where are we aiming, Stumpy? He called. Drogon started toward Mada's head and made quick sign language for eyes and then for shush, reminding Jarek that this wasn't some dumb brute they were riding. Mada was probably listening, and Jarek doubted the Kull would be pleased with their plan to come gouge his eyes out. So he drew the whacker quietly and started forward to join Drogon, figuring speed was their best friend right now. Rachel padded along right beside him. When Mada lurched backward another step, they were ready for it. But when the Kull actually tried to throw them off, Jarek had been wondering whether Mada was simply too stunned or too large to notice, or care, about the little pests on his back. But no. He'd just been waiting for them to get closer to his head for maximum whiplash effect. Jarek fell to his left knee on the first sweep of Mada's gigantic head. He jammed his sword blade down into the thick scruff of the Kull's neck hide and reached for Rachel, who teetered dangerously. The sword sank deep enough to give him some semblance of an anchor, but Rachel was too far to reach, at least until she jabbed her staff his way. He grabbed the staff and yanked her to him just as Mada finished the first half of his enormous headshake and flung them back the other way. It was like a demented amusement ride. Jarek held on, squeezing Rachel to him, planting his knee against the buried blade for support. They reached the apex of the swing. Stilled for one peaceful moment, Jarek's stomach fell as Mada tilted his head to an angle that rendered his sword useless as an anchor. Then the Kull whipped his head high right. No, Jarek growled, gripping Rachel close, trying in futility to hold on. The sword slid free, and they left Mada's head, flying into open sky. For an instant, Jarek was frozen, time seeming to dilate just long enough to make him painfully aware of just how completely helpless he was. Then something clamped around his wrist, and Drogon was there, belly down in Mada's fur, limbs spread wide, every claw that wasn't gripping Jarek's wrist buried firmly in the Kull's hide. Mada's enormous head braked at the end of the swing, dropping them back to the furry terrain. They all took copious handfuls of the thick fur just before the Kull tilted his head up to loose a frustrated bellow that made Jarek's insides vibrate oddly. They scrambled to their feet and pushed on as best they could on the shaky terrain, determined to reach their target before Mada tried to uproot them again. Up on the mountain ridge, Jarek caught a glimpse of Harga streaking around with a rust-red Krogoth clinging to his thick back. The rest of Krogoth's Rachnoth were busy with Shimo and a vaguely robotic-looking Kull Jarek had never seen. Ogren circled on leathery wings above, preparing to dive. Jarek was just beginning to wonder where the new Kull bot had come from when a low, rushing sound overhead announced the passing of the most likely answer, a Rakul ship. Something landed on Mada's back behind them with a thud that almost made Jarek feel bad for the Kull. Almost. Mada made a mournful sound like the universe's most enormous cow as Jarek spun to face the newcomer. Cool Gada. Wonderful. Gada didn't seem to notice or care about the pain his landing had caused his enormous brother. He just stalked toward them across Mada's back, finger blades elongating.
Jarek Slater.
He hissed the name, with a kind of fanatic hunger that made Jarek's insides crawl. Jarek waved anyway. Hey, Gada. Beneath them, Mada gave a rumbling groan that sounded decidedly indignant. Jarek looked down at the furryland mass and back to Gada. Why is it I keep getting the feeling no one really likes you? Gada's only answer was a deep roar as he broke into a charge. Jarek glanced back to tell Drogon and Rachel to get on with the mammoth problem while he held Gada off. He froze at what he saw. Down! He barked. They dropped without question, just in time to avoid Ogren's flyby tackle. Jarek tucked into a sideways roll as the big gargoyle banked around to try to catch him instead. Long gray fingers missed him by a few inches, and Ogren slammed down to a hard landing beside Gada, empty-handed. In response, Mada discharged a monstrous snort. Jarek picked himself up, and a wave of fearful déjà vu swept through him at the sight of the two Coles stalking toward him. With it came the painful reminder of Mosen's final moments, and he clutched his sword tighter. Just the two a-holes I wanted to kill, he muttered. Gada gave a vicious snarl. Ogren just seemed to sneer. Then the two Cole rushed in eagerly to finish what they'd started at the farmhouse. Only Jarek wasn't alone this time. When he dipped back from Ogren's lunging grab, Drogon was there to catch the muscly gargoyle with a cold clock to the side of the head. When Gada sprang in to catch Jarek at the end of his dodge, Rachel was there with a telekinetic blast that nearly sent the Cole tumbling off Mada's wide back. After that, Gada and Ogren grew more disciplined, and the fighting quickly grew in ferocity. As well as they fought together, Jarek had little doubt he and Drogon would have been in trouble had it just been the two of them. But for every advantage the two Coles held over them in strength and durability, Rachel was there, telekinetically tipping balances and deflecting blows, conjuring flashes of fire and light to harry and distract. The furry plane of Mada's back shifted below them as they fought, tilting steeper, until they nearly had to find handholds to avoid falling. Mada was mounting the mountain, Jarek realized. Perhaps intending to go squish Krogoth and his Rachnoth underfoot, or maybe just to stomp until the complex collapsed below. Whether that was physically possible or not, Jarek couldn't really fathom. He didn't want to find out. But before they could stop Mada, they had to get Ogren and Gada off their backs, or off Mada's at least. Jarek was drawing back to hack at Ogren's exposed flank when a sonorous crack from below startled all of them. With a sound like a watermelon hitting pavement from a 10-story drop, a section of Mada's enormous head exploded outward in a shower of dark blood, shattered skull, and God knew what else. Jarek's brain had only begun to register that something had shot the Cole, something big, when Mada pitched sideways with a mournful bellow. Jarek wasn't ready for it. He had nothing to grab, nothing to stabilize with. He caught a glimpse of Drogon holding Rachel in one arm and clinging to Mada's fur with the other. Then gravity took him past the tipping point, and he was tumbling for open sky.
Jarek!
Rachel's shout, too distant. He tucked and spun as fast as he could, free hand flailing wildly for something, anything, as he tried to reorient his feet downward. The world spun. His stomach quailed in protest. Something brushed his hand. He grabbed and squeezed, held on for dear life. A handful of Mada's thick hairs yanked his descent to a halt, or nearly to a halt at least, before they tore free with a dry, ripping sound. The next handful held. Then Mada hit the mountainside, and for a second, Jarek was thrown against the furry wall of the Cole's bulk so hard that he couldn't have fallen even if he'd let go. He only barely managed to hold on to the whacker through the impact. Then Mada moved through a series of colossal shifts, and he nearly had to ditch the blade anyway in favor of a second handful of furry lifeline. When the madness stopped, he strapped the sword to his back and grabbed another furry handhold. He was suspended maybe a third of the way down Mada's front right leg, which still probably put him a good 80 feet off the ground. The enormous skull seemed to have stabilized itself despite the small hole that had just been blown through his head. And as for who'd blown said hole through said head, Jarek saw them below now. Several men in a frenzy of activity by a few trucks at the mouth of the south portal, working around a car-sized heap of metal, coils, and cables that had to be Price's railgun. They must have moved it out with one of the trucks. And there, right beside the thing, snapping commands and tapping away at a tablet, was Price. James was there too, and Michael and Chambers, helping the Enochian load something into the rear end of the big weapon. No sooner had Jarek recognized his friends than Ogren swooped down overhead, bound straight for them.
No!
He shouted. There was nothing he could do. Nothing but to watch helplessly. The gargoyle slammed to a hard landing and slapped Price across the asphalt like a cheap toy. Jarek felt sick.
Price!
He wasn't moving. James was down too, clipped by the same blow that had taken Price, a blow that probably could have overturned a car. Michael and Chambers were scrambling for their weapons. Ogren approached James with predatory confidence, paying them no mind. The Enochian scuttled backward in an awkward crab walk, one arm hanging loosely at his side. A gunshot cracked below, and another, each one coinciding with tiny jerks that might have been bullets striking Ogren's head. The Cull paused, glancing around to the spot 10 yards in front of the railgun. The spot where Jarek only now noticed Alaric. The commander stood with a single smoking revolver raised, every bone in his body screaming defiance in the face of Ogren's clear superiority. Ogren sneered and leapt for Alaric, wings unfurling to shift his jump into a glide. Jarek half expected Alaric to hold his ground till the bitter end. Instead, the wiry commander turned and dove over the edge of a small rocky crag behind him. Not that the cover would do him much good. Jarek had to get down there. He was preparing to drop into a fur-ripping leapfrog down Mada's leg when he noticed James tapping furiously at the tablet he'd crawled to after Ogren had left him. Michael shouted something from the rear of the railgun. Chambers yanked him aside. Ogren landed over Alaric, turned. James jabbed his finger to the tablet. There was another loud cracking sound, and Ogren's head disappeared in an explosion of black ichor. Serve the fucker right.
Make a broadcast, Al,
Jarek growled, beginning the hand-over-hand climb up Mada's furry leg.
Tell them to get their asses out here with whatever medical they have.
Already on it, sir.
Jarek climbed in silence for the next several seconds, too flustered to make much sense out of the commotion carrying to his ears from multiple battles above. A heavy thud off to the left drew his attention, and he saw Gada lying belly up in a small crater over 100 feet below, having apparently fallen from Mada's back. Drogon lay face down a few yards away from Gada, unmoving. Jarek gritted his teeth and kept climbing, part of him hoping Gada was dead and Drogon was fine, and the other part hoping they were both fine, just so he and Drogon could finish kicking Gada's ass to pieces together. First, though, he needed to find Rachel and end Mada's lumbering stampede. He reached for the next handful of fur. Something landed on his back and wrapped an arm around his throat. He had a split second to register the orange appendage as Fraga's before a dark, glassy dagger plunged for his chest. His breath caught. Nothing. There was nothing he could do. The dagger hit a wall of thin air and careened wildly off. Jarek stared dumbly for a moment, then grabbed the short leg dangling by his right side in a crushing grip and hurled Fraga as hard as he could. The little bastard nearly managed to keep his hold on Jarek's throat, but finally lost his grip and shot away with a snarl. His second dagger left a shallow gash across Jarek's chest plates. Jarek didn't bother trying to figure out where Fraga was headed when he vanished. He just grabbed another handful of Mada's fur and kept climbing toward his golden-haired savior. Invisible hands lightened the last few feet of his climb, and then Rachel was there, helping him up the rest of the way. She looked pale and exhausted, like she'd already channeled more than enough energy for the rest of the decade. "This ride sucks," she groaned between heavy breaths.
You said it.
Jarek drew his sword and scanned the mountain ridge Mata appeared to be preparing to make another push for. He wasn't sure it was worth the Cole's effort. Only 3 Rachnoths still stood, as far as he could see, and none of them looked as if they had great chances of remaining that way much longer with Shimo, Harga, and the mysterious mechanized Kulbot pressing in on them. The human forces had scattered. The Enochians, Zack, and a few others were beating a retreat down the mountainside. James and the others at the south portal were scrambling to retreat into the tunnel and away from Fraga, who'd already left 3 soldiers dead and the railgun in a smoking heap. They were losing. Oghren might be dead, and Gada and this unholy mammoth at least injured, but they were still losing. No doubt about it. Jarek looked to the northeast and felt a small flutter of hope at the sight of tiny figures piling into vans and trucks in the distant lot. The complex evacuees fleeing the base. There was that, at least.
Rachel Cross!
The roar tore Jarek's gaze back to the mountain in time to see Krogoth hurl a man-sized boulder off a nearby ridge into an arcing trajectory toward Mata's head. The stone must have broken loose in one of Mata's impacts. It was long and more flat than round, vaguely resembling a giant arrowhead. Which was exactly what Krogoth intended it to be, he realized. Rachel extended her hand, eyes drifting closed. On the ridge above, Fraga popped into existence right beside Krogoth.
Krogoth!
Jarek shouted, starting helplessly forward. Too late. Fraga's dagger plunged into Krogoth's ribs before the word finished leaving his mouth. Krogoth roared and grabbed Fraga by the throat. Jarek froze, unsure what to do, how to help anyone in time. Apparently, Rachel didn't share his dilemma, focused as she was. Her wordless cry erupted from behind, and the boulder, already tumbling rapidly toward Mata's raised head, accelerated downward as if fired from its own invisible railgun. Jarek couldn't imagine how much energy it took to shoot something that big, that fast. It punched straight through Mata's eye like an enormous bullet, a resounding wet thud smacking through the air. Mata jerked, the kind of sickly jerk Jarek had come to associate with someone being brained. And given the way the furry back under Jarek's feet began to sway, he was guessing that interpretation might apply to giant mammoths as well. Time to bail. He turned to tell Rachel, just in time to see her unconscious body tumbling limply over Mata's side as the giant beast swayed.
Rachel!
He lunged desperately forward. No time. No chance of catching her before it was too late. So he dove for her without another thought. No time for thought. Not until he caught her in his arms and found himself in free fall with her. He wasted a precious second staring dumbly at the rapidly rising ground.
The whacker, sir!
Al cried.
What?
Swing the whacker!
Jarek didn't have time to question. He swung the damn whacker, and immediately realized what Al was driving at when the weapon flashed weak blue light and resisted his hand as if it were fixed to something more than thin air. He swung again. 60 feet. It was like trying to do a one-armed pull-up on a bar suspended by wobbly bands. It wasn't going to be enough. He swung again anyway. 20 feet. He cocked his arm back for another swing, thinking about how he'd try to roll when they hit. Then Drogon appeared directly below them, arms outstretched. He tucked and spun as best he could, offering his back to Drogon and 2 bodies worth of buffer to Rachel. They hit. It wasn't pretty. The world became a jumbled blur of colors, motion, and jarring impacts. No coherent thoughts in his mind aside from sympathy for Drogon, who was crushed beneath them on impact, and the overwhelming need to keep Rachel safe as they bounced and skipped through a few rough revolutions down the mountainside. He managed to plant his feet and pull them out of the tumble, sitting in an upright position with Rachel's limp body cradled in his arms. Shaken, he turned to see how Drogon had fared. A hard shove hit him in the back and sent them sailing before he could. Uncomprehending, desperate, he twisted through the air and landed so his back was to the ground and Rachel was on his chest. They hit and kept sliding down the rocky grade, Jarek reaching out to stop them, until he saw the enormous furry wall collapsing down on top of them. Mada. Falling. He caught a flash of Drogon's red eyes. Then Mada's bulk slammed down with a thunderous boom, burying his friend and missing him and Rachel by mere yards.
Stumpy!
Jarek shouted. Then again, louder. The air was filled with dust and the sound of crumbling rock. So much of it coming down. A roar and a shriek in the distance. Then nothing.
Stumpy,
Jarek groaned, pulling himself up, careful not to jostle Rachel in the process.
Shit!
Was there any way the Rachnoth had survived that? He didn't know. But there was probably nothing Jarek could do for him right now. Not before he checked on Rachel, at least. She was still alive. He was confident about that as he carted her further down the mountain, away from the dust and shifting rocks. Or maybe it was just that he wasn't ready to even think about the alternative. But no. As he settled to the ground with her, she shifted uneasily and murmured a few disoriented words. Thank God. He nestled her carefully against himself, keeping her shoulders and head supported against his leg and arm. He looked back at the devastation, trying to take stock and gauge their current predicament. Everything hurt, head to toe. The worst was his pierced leg, radiating a profound sickly ache with pulsing overcurrents of sharper pain. Drogon was still smashed under Mada's bulk. Alive or dead, he didn't know. To the right, the south portal had collapsed, or was at least obscured, under the rivers of rubble Mada's collapse had brought down. Jarek could only hope to God Price, Alaric, the Enochians, and all the other soldiers managed to retreat far enough down the tunnel in time to avoid being crushed. On the mountainside above, Krogoth lay bloody and torn beside Harga, whose enormous jaws had been torn apart, his entire head nearly split in two. Neither of them were moving, nor were the rest of the Rachnoth above. The Rakul, on the other hand, they picked their way through the dust and crumbling rock, making their unhurried ways down the mountainside. Shimo, Fraga, and the oddly robotic Kull that scuttled over the uneven terrain on 4 mechanical appendages. Too many crimson eyes still burning, all of them fixed on Jarek and Rachel. Jarek's mouth was entirely too dry to swallow, but his throat tried all the same. The only spot of sunshine was the line of vehicles rolling down the road to the northeast, ferrying dozens of evacuees steadily away from Cheyenne. At least there was that. But that didn't change the fact that he and Rachel were the last two standing, or huddling, as it were, against at least 3 Rakul. The sight of Gada stomping out from around Mada's enormous fallen form, and making it an even 4, didn't make matters any better. Rachel stirred in his arms with a heavy groan. He slid open his faceplate and bent over her, too worried about her, and too tired and beaten to care for the moment about the Rakul picking their leisurely way down to them. She blinked up at him. "Did we win?" she croaked. He stroked a few hairs from her forehead. "Not yet, Goldilocks, but I think we have him on the ropes." She looked around woozily, silently taking in the gravity of their situation. Then she met his eyes and, of all things, smiled. The most beautiful, sad smile he'd ever seen. "Got him right where we want him?" He smiled back, trying to convey every bit of the love he felt for her in that moment, fighting the tears that suddenly wanted to come. Exactly. She touched his face with a pale, cold hand, then tried to sit up with a groan. He was shifting to help her when a shadow sped over them. Jarek looked up, stomach sinking, expecting to see a Rakul ship descending on them. There was a ship, a big one, bigger than he could even wrap his head around. But it was the thing plummeting from the enormous hatch in the ship's underbelly that held Jarek's attention. It dropped like a colossal bird of prey and pulled up maybe a quarter-mile from the ground, unfurling wings that would have put the most massive of sails to shame. They beat with a sound like crashing thunder. Once, twice, 3 times. Then the gargantuan beast that Jarek could only describe as an honest-to-Christ dragon dropped to the earth with a resounding boom that jolted straight through Jarek's spine and into his racing heart. "Kulnaga," Rachel whispered. "Yeah," Jarek said slowly. "On second thought, that might put a little wrinkle in things." Chapter 33. For a long few moments, all Rachel could do was stare. The mountain-sized mothership above was impressive enough, defying her brain's feeble attempts at comprehension. Her attention, though, was more rooted to the monstrosity that had just fallen from said ship, the one that had hit the earth like a force of nature, crushing the last faint inkling of hope they'd had of making it through this thing alive. Kulnaga, the world ender. It was a bit rich, wasn't it? Then again, considering the way the beast had seemed to shake the entire planet when he'd landed, maybe not. Fortunately, Naga didn't appear to be in any great hurry to come stomp their petty little lives back to the void. And why would he be? Naga was easily as big as Mada, and 10 times as ferocious looking. 20 times, actually, once she recalled the memories Halden had shown her of the beastly dragon tearing his way through that clan of frost giants. And that had been a couple thousand years ago. How in the hell did she even begin to fathom hurting something so colossally powerful? She reminded herself that she'd had that exact thought about Mada before Krogoth had come through with his stony solution. But as far as she could tell, it was only her and Jarek now, and neither one of them was in any condition to be hurling boulders. She thought of Halden and Elise, lying cold and still in Dola's office below, and felt the need both to punch something and to be ill. So much power, such young, good lives, all gone. And now it was up to them to what? Kill this thing? Save the day? "Suppose it would have been too much to ask for a few storm clouds," she muttered. Not that striking Naga down with lightning would have been likely to work in that case anyway. Jarek shifted to look at her. "You know what I wish?" "What's that?" He shook his head, looking wistful. "A good month or two. You and me. None of this bullshit. No one trying to destroy the goddamn planet. Definitely no clothes. Would that have been too much to ask?" She smiled and started pulling her painstaking way to her feet. "You'd have gotten sick of it. 2 weeks, tops." He was watching her from the ground when she turned, utter exhaustion in his eyes. But something else, too. Something that made her insides flutter. Never mind the Galaxy-class killers nearby. "I could never get sick of you, Goldilocks." She looked around at the circling Rakul and swallowed, fighting the frantic desperation that tried to grab a hold of her good senses. "It's a bet, then?" He nodded and started crawling to his feet. "As soon as we finish slapping these a-holes silly, you're on. 2 months. It was only then she realized he was missing his sword. She scanned their surroundings and spotted it near the fallen mass of Mada, closer to where they must have originally landed. She wasn't really sure how they'd even pulled that off without dying, but that might just have to go on the suddenly too long list of things she probably wasn't going to be getting any closure on. The Rakul were watching them silently, the small ones having formed a rough semicircle about 30 yards away, walling them in toward Naga, who hadn't moved a twitch since he'd landed about 200 yards away. None of them gave one iota of concern to the convoy of vehicles disappearing down the distant road. That was something. If nothing else, at least they'd accomplished that today. Rachel focused back on the sword and telekinetically yanked it over. Jarek caught it shakily and gave her a grim nod of thanks. "So how do you want to do this thing?" She tried to put on a brave face and ignore how beaten to shit he looked and she felt. "You're telling me you never dreamed of charging into battle with a dragon?" He gave an amused huff that turned into a dusty cough. "Of course. Totally. So, like, on 3 then?" Something broke in her, looking at him. She didn't see it coming. Couldn't even say what it was at first. Just something about the look in his eye. Something that went beyond the fear she'd seen in those dark eyes a few times in the past. Something that understood the current situation with morbid certainty. They were going to die here. She turned toward Naga, unable to face that horrible realization in Jarek's eyes. Ahead, Naga started forward with calm detachment, his first steps sending light tremors through the mountainside. "Rachel?" Jarek's tone was soft. She looked back at him, trying to keep the tears in, trying to force a smile, if only so it could be the last way he saw her. He licked his cracked lips, his gaze unwavering from hers, despite the enormous alien dragon stomping up the mountain behind her. He swallowed and shook his head, smiling at his own hesitance. Then, with a small shrug, as if he were simply stating the obvious, "I love you." Longing and regret and furious frustration all swirled through her underneath the persistent dread at what was coming. It wasn't fair. Not a single damn part of any of this was fair. That this should happen now, here of all places. But it was happening. All of it was happening. There was nothing left to it. All she could do was say the words back. Just this once. But they wouldn't come out. Why wouldn't they come out? She wanted to cry, was crying, she realized. A bittersweet smile pulling at her lips. She wanted to say the words. But the smile widened, taking on a life of its own in a way that made her wonder if she hadn't just cracked. "I know," she whispered, still smiling. Then she turned and charged straight at the oncoming dragon. "You... Hey!" Jarek cried after her. "You can't just pull a solo on me, lady!" She kept running, heart racing, her smile twisting into something frantic, desperate. He caught up to her, clearly limping, and just as clearly determined to stick with her until he couldn't. Maybe they were going to die. Whatever they were going to do, it'd be together. And she'd be damned if she was going to give either of them a reason to think they'd found their closure and could give in. Not while they could still draw breath. "Going for the eyes," Jarek grunted between breaths. His faceplate slid closed.
"Might have to climb."
An idea struck her. Not a good one, but she wasn't sure there were any of those left at this point. "Need a boost?" He didn't answer right away, and she didn't blame him. The dread was growing in her chest, heavier and heavier with each step they took, and with every prospective inch of scaly height Naga seemed to gain. He loomed over them, regal and terrible and utterly unthreatened. When she glanced over, she realized Jarek was slowing down. Or was it her that had started it? He glanced over his shoulder. She followed his gaze and realized the rest of the Rakul were following them, closing slowly, ready to pounce when easy opportunity arose. Just like that, all the momentum of their combined determination hit a wall, trickling away down the shallow grade of the mountainside. Her stomach fell, and despair crept in. What had possessed her to think the others would politely wait their turns? Some feeble hope their honor would mandate that they allow a proper contest, she supposed. But it was probably too late for that. As far as she knew, it had been well over 1,000 years since a Kull had died. Now, since arriving on Earth, the Rakul had lost 5 of their number. They had no intention of making this anything but a slaughter. Her step faltered. They weren't running anymore, just tensing together, sword and staff at the ready, trying to look every direction at once. They turned back to back, Jarek facing Naga, Rachel facing Gada and Shimo and the mountain beyond. And that was when she noticed the pair of figures standing tall on the mountain ridge high above. "Jarek," she whispered, not turning away.
Is that?
Jarek started to ask behind her. Then one of the figures on the ridge reached for something at their chest, and Jarek's voice was washed out by the powerful presence that rolled over her senses, vast and alien, yet familiar in an odd way. It felt like Halden, and it felt like Alton. Somehow it was both, and it frightened her. But fright spilled over to hope as the thing that was both Halden Raish and Alton Parker gathered itself and sprang from the mountain. It was an impossible leap, well beyond what even a Rachnoth could have managed. He sailed through the air like a humanoid missile, barreling straight for Naga's head, which had raised to inspect the new arrival, cocked with curiosity.
Is he?
Jarek said slowly.
He's not, seriously.
Neither they nor the Rakul below could seem to do anything but gape as the hybrid flew on as if propelled by more than his initial jump. Naga, on the other hand, growled an earth-shaking growl and swept an enormous hand back, preparing to swat the Halden-Alton hybrid out of the air like the gnat he comparatively was. Before he drew within Naga's striking range, though, Halden threw his arms wide, cocking his own fist back and pulled to a dead halt in midair. Then, suspended 50 feet above their heads, he thrust an open palm forward with an inhuman cry. To Rachel's extended senses, the flare of channeled power was like staring straight at the sun. To Naga, though, it must have been a whole lot worse. It was like the Kull had been struck by a speeding glacier. It was impossible. And yet, Rachel watched in slack-jawed astonishment as the dragon that was the size of a small mountain toppled backward with a haunting vibration somewhere between a keen and a groan. He slammed onto his back hard enough to cause a minor earthquake beneath their feet. Halden dropped the last 50 feet straight down and landed between them and Naga with his own soft thud, radiating confident power despite the fact that the size mismatch should have been laughable. A second later, Elise slammed down beside him, fists clenched and dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, Jarek thrust his sword to the sky and shouted,
Fuck yes!
Behind them, Gada growled and took a step forward. The rest of the Rakul only watched on uncertainly, as Naga labored to roll back to his gargantuan haunches with a difficulty that suggested it had been millennia since he'd had cause to recover from such a blow. When he did, though, the roar he let loose was unlike anything Rachel had ever experienced. It hit her entire body, so loud she could barely process what was happening at first. She nearly fell to her knees under the raw telepathic pressure. Jarek held on to her, apparently sensing her instability and at least somewhat protected by Fila. Halden and Elise stood steady through the entire thing, wary but strong. "You picked the wrong species to fuck with," Halden said when it was over, his voice oddly muffled to her ears in the wake of Naga's roar. "And now you'll end no more worlds, Kulnaga," Elise said.
Yeah, what they said!
Jarek called.
You big scaly a-hole!
If Naga had any thoughts on the matter, he didn't see fit to communicate them. He just charged. And, with a hair-raising chorus of shrieks and growls, so did the rest of the Rakul. Chapter 34. The ground shook with Naga's first attack. Rachel didn't have time to see if Elise and Halden had evaded it. She was already whirling around to face the other incoming threats beside Jarek. Gada was first to lunge in, eager to finally claim their heads. She felt more than saw Jarek stepping in to catch the Kull with a low sword sweep. She added her own telekinetic battering ram to the side of Gada's head, and their low-high combo took the Kull off his feet and tumbling past them. Rachel stuck close to Jarek's back as he stepped in to engage Shimo and the robotic-looking Kull with its 4 mechanical legs and long, snaking arms. She risked a quick glance back and saw Elise darting up one of Naga's forearms, while Halden leapt straight for the Kull's head. They were powerful, there was no doubt about that. But powerful enough to kill something so gargantuan, so ferocious? That was hard to believe. Almost as hard to believe as the thought that her and Jarek could hope to keep 4 Rakul off their backs while they did it. Thud. "Make that 5 Rakul," she grimly amended, as Vermaga's leathery, amorphous form slammed down from one of the ships above. Her step faltered at the surprise entrance. Jarek, on the other hand, opened up with an unexpected burst of speed and claimed Shimo's remaining foreleg with a flash of azure light and a shriek like rusty iron. Rachel could have cheered if not for the telltale pop of Fraga's sudden appearance and the dark obsidian dagger he promptly hurled at Jarek. She caught the dagger with telekinesis and flung it deep into Vermaga instead. When her extended senses rippled to her exposed right, she didn't think, just swung her staff as hard as she could. The blow caught Fraga in the torso just as he popped into existence with a dagger cocked back to strike. It wasn't much, her puny human swing, but Fraga was small, and it was enough to knock him away. It was also enough to send her tumbling over when her exhausted legs failed to catch up on her balance. She hit the dusty rock with a heavy oomph. Off to the left, she heard Jarek fighting on, and, to the right, Fraga was already darting in, unperturbed by her staff strike. She caught him with telekinesis, and conjured a flare that left her head buzzing and Fraga's eyes temporarily fried, judging by the way he clutched at them. She hurled him 50 feet straight backward before he could do anything about it, then moved to pull herself back to her feet. The shaking ground informed her there wasn't time for that. Gada, charging in from behind to crush her where she lay. She couldn't move, didn't even have time to try to call for help. Gada stomped in, raising a thick foot with violent intent. Rachel drew what energy she could, and a dark shape blurred in and hit Gada with a sidekick that sent him sailing like a huge, spiky cannonball. Elise. Rachel blew out a relieved breath and hurried to her feet, turning back for Jarek. Elise was already sweeping past her. Jarek had managed to clamber up onto Shimo's back and was clinging tightly to his unwilling mount with one arm, throwing wild sword swings at the other Kulls as they tried to close in. The mechanical Kull had just snared one of its jointed tentacles around Jarek's ankle when Elise slammed into the thing with a shoulder tackle that looked like it should have broken something inside her. Instead, the Kull took flight. Elise whirled on Shimo, looking ready to tear off his legs. Fraga appeared with a sneak attack, but Elise was ready. She dodged his out-of-nowhere stab with inhuman speed and slammed a fist down on top of his head so hard that he didn't manage to blink off to safety. He just hit the ground with a low, cracking sound. Elise rounded on Vermaga. Too late. The Cull caught her with a solid smack that sent her flying for the wreckage of the south portal. Rachel reached out, thinking to telekinetically catch her. A cry from Jarek drew her attention before she could. In the chaos, Shimo had somehow bucked Jarek to the ground, and now the big mantis was rounding on him with the sharp stalks of his remaining legs. Shimo reared, and Jarek rolled. The Cull's stomp cracked through hard rock like plastic, missing Jarek by inches. Desperate, Rachel thrust out with both hands, pulling for power, and hit Shimo with everything she had left. It wasn't as impressive as the hits Super Elise was throwing, but considering everything Rachel had already been through in the past hour, it wasn't half bad. Shimo flew far enough that he struck Mada's enormous body before hitting the ground. Rachel took a more direct route to the stony earth, falling to her knees as the fresh wave of channeling fatigue crashed down on her. She forced herself to look up and reassess their threats. Shimo was picking himself up from his awkward landing. Vermaga was gliding that way as well, and, looking further back, Rachel realized why. The smallest of the Rakul ships was descending to the right of Mada's fallen bulk, seemingly at the behest of the mechanical Cull, who hadn't bothered rejoining the fight after getting a taste of Elise's linebacker special. But why were they all— A roar to the left shook her focus. Gada. But he was fixed on the ship as well, roaring at his own kin. Rachel felt the telepathic traffic passing between them, but couldn't hear the message. Probably wouldn't have understood it even if she could. Whatever it was, Gada didn't look happy. Especially not as the mechanical Cull gathered itself and sprang up to the open ship hatch a good 20 yards above. Vermaga glided after his kin, looking intent on doing the same, and Shimo seemed to be debating himself. It was almost like— could it be? Were they retreating? The first flicker of hope touched at her exhausted brain. Then Gada stomped the ground like a wild animal and turned to charge Jarek. Rachel lumbered forward, head spinning and stomach churning with the cumulative exhaustion. Jarek rolled to his feet and nearly fell back over. Why would the Rakul retreat now, when they were down to 4 defenders, 2 of whom were clearly on their last legs, and 1 of whom was currently tangling with a goddamn space dragon? It didn't matter. All that mattered was that she and Jarek took advantage of the improved odds before the bastards changed their minds. But Elise darted past before they could. "Sword!" she cried. Jarek hesitated for a second, then hurled the whacker after her. The long, spinning arc of its flight stabilized in mid-air, and the sword snapped to Elise's waiting hand. She didn't break stride, just charged straight in to meet Gada. Before the change, Elise, like Halden, had been astoundingly quick and agile, both of them nearly preternaturally so. Now, though, it was like watching a choreographed dance. Each of Gada's devastating swipes rushed through nothing but thin air. Elise danced over or under every blow, outside or inside. She moved like she knew what would happen 2 steps in advance, and was merely shuffling through the requisite countersteps. She caught Gada's flank with a sword strike that dropped him to a knee. She twisted under a grab and removed the offending hand at the thick wrist, bladed fingers and all. A deep cut to his chest, another to the opposite leg. Elise dismantled Gada with disturbing efficiency until he collapsed at her feet, heaving with too much pain and bodily damage to do anything but stare in disbelief. On his knees, Gada's eyes were only a foot above Elise's, close enough to level. She stood facing him, eyes brimming with the faint beginnings of a soft red glow. "For our master Zarkol," she growled, in a voice that reminded Rachel that Elise was not alone in there. Gada bared his fangs in a snarl. Then, with a tremendously fast swipe and a brilliant flash of azure, Elise cut his head off. Rachel and Jarek watched in stunned silence, leaning heavily on one another. Elise stood over her kill for a long breath, as if taking the moment to document the memory. Then she spun and darted off toward Halden and Kulnaga, still clutching Jarek's sword. A glance down the mountainside showed why. In the chaos, Rachel hadn't had time to check how Halden was faring. Wasn't even sure she'd wanted to know, considering. The answer was about as well as could be expected. The colossal dragon towered over Halden, long neck lowered to their struggle. Halden was braced on the ground, hands planted against two of Naga's huge fangs. Rachel couldn't quite tell if it was Naga trying to snap his prey up, or Halden trying to force his way in. Either way, neither one of them looked too happy about it.
Rach,
Jarek said behind her. She followed his gaze and saw Fraga picking himself up from the ground nearby. The small Kull shook himself off and considered the two of them for a long second. Rachel tensed, reaching for power she wasn't sure she had any hope of finding. But then Fraga looked up to his brother's ship and vanished with a small pop. A sound of deep pain rumbled off to the right, and Rachel looked in time to see Jarek's sword tearing free from one of Naga's enormous red eyes to fly back to Elise's hand, as if on an invisible mag rail. Above, the ship drifted higher, easing forward to pass over Naga's battle with the Enochians. A quick scan of the area around Mada told her Shimo and Vermaga must have boarded, while Elise had been busy taking Gada to pieces. So, reasonably sure their backs were safe for the moment, Rachel and Jarek turned and began to limp their way toward Naga and the Enochians. They held on to one another for support, neither of them pointing out that both of their tanks were clearly too far past empty for them to expect to be much help in the fight. They plodded on anyway. Halden was at least 100 feet in the air now, taken along for the ride when Naga had recoiled from Elise's attack. Elise called something, and Halden sprang away from Naga's fangs. Or tried to, at least. The instant Halden gave him the room, Naga struck like an oversized viper, catching the Enochian by the left arm with fangs the size of Halden's body. Elise's scream joined Halden's cry of pain, and Naga's satisfied rumble. "No!" Rachel heard herself shout. Elise cocked Jarek's sword back, preparing to throw. Naga whipped his huge head before she could, and Halden tore free like a speeding bullet, minus his left arm. The Enochian hit the mountainside in an explosion of rock and dirt, faster than Rachel's mind could process, until he'd skipped a couple dozen yards toward them. Ahead, Elise threw the sword. Naga jerked his head to the right, taking the blade on the snout to protect his remaining eye. Jarek hurried forward to where Halden was already picking himself up. "We're fine," Halden growled as Jarek reached to help him. We're? It seemed to take Jarek aback too, but they hardly had time to worry about that, or about the fact that Halden was apparently going to pretend like he hadn't just lost an arm. Elise touched down beside them with a heavy thud, Jarek's sword in hand. "You're okay, my love?" she asked with a quick look at Halden's arm, or lack thereof. Halden stood to his full height by Elise, his gaze never leaving Naga. "It'll take a lot more than that to stop us." Ahead, Naga shifted, seeming to consider Halden's words as he watched them with his single crimson eye. His left eye only sputtered with a feeble glow, spilling clear fluids down the side of his enormous head. Rachel and Jarek drew up beside the Enochians. Elise offered Jarek his sword. He waited for her to keep it, which seemed like a good call, seeing as she could probably swing it about 10 times harder than he could right now. Together, the four of them faced Kulnaga, who'd grown silent and still. The huge dragon tilted his snout skyward, considering his ally's ship now hovering far overhead. For a second, Rachel could have sworn the ship wavered under Naga's gaze. Then it surged forward, quickly fading into the distance as it ascended to the clouds and beyond. Naga's enormous head tipped back down, and he swept his gaze around the wreckage of Cheyenne, taking in the extensive damage and casualties before finally settling back on them. He was going to charge. She was sure of it. But then he raised a massive forepaw to the ruined mess of his eye, slowly, almost absent-mindedly. tense silence stretched. Then Naga slammed his forepaws to the earth, gave a gale-force snort and a shake of his head, and leapt into the air on tremendously powerful haunches. His wings shot out, catching the air in a series of quick, sonorous beats, and then he was rising. "We should stop him," came Halden's voice in her mind. Or maybe it was Alton's. She could barely tell. And given that it looked an awful lot like Naga was fixing to leave, she wasn't even sure whether to agree or argue with the sentiment. But she also couldn't fathom what the hell they were supposed to do about it either way. Each beat of Naga's wings hit them like a small tornado. Rachel would have fallen if Jarek hadn't been holding her. And given how damn beaten he was, Jarek might have fallen too if Elise hadn't been holding him. Even Halden staggered, finally starting to show hints of looking like a guy who'd just lost an arm. When Naga was nearly 200 yards above, he angled around to face them and hung there, bobbing a good 20 yards up and down with each humongous beat of his wings.
"You think yourselves heroes?"
came a voice like the stone of an ancient mountain.
"You are but dust, waiting only to be swept back to the void from whence you came. When this world has moved on, when your distant descendants have forgotten, that is when we will return to see it done."
And with that, Cool Naga turned with a few mighty beats of his wings and began climbing for his waiting ship, each thunderous beat drawing him higher and higher. Halden looked like he was considering trying to take telekinetic flight after the cull. If he escapes now, peace, came Elise's thought. Or maybe it was Lietha's. We are not yet ready to see it through to the end. Halden radiated frustration and displeasure, but he didn't argue. Above, Naga reached his ship and climbed up through the open hatch. Rachel thought she caught a glimpse of his crimson eyes staring down at them. Then the enormous hatch drew shut, and the ship began to rise. They watched in silence until it was a distant speck in the clear blue sky. Then Jarek collapsed to the ground with a monumental groan that sounded equal parts pained, exhausted, and relieved. Rachel went with him, not even bothering to try for balance with her support pillar gone. She lay beside him on the dusty, sun-kissed stone, enjoying every grateful breath of air she took in. Much as they'd earned it, she was still a bit surprised when Halden and Elise likewise hit the dirt, both of them shaking from their exertions. Or maybe from something else entirely, something to do with their new bodies. "You guys okay?" she asked, having to work to even find the energy for the simple act of speaking. "We are," Elise started, looking a little uncertain as to how to finish. "Tired," Halden provided. Elise nodded. "But we will survive." "Amen," Jarek croaked. "I'm never moving again." He could say that again. Rachel couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so utterly drained. Probably because she never had been. There was work to be done, maybe more now than ever before. She couldn't buy that it was over. Not just like that. But for the moment, it seemed they were safe and relatively stable. So Rachel lay her head back, closed her eyes, and, for a while, allowed herself to enjoy the simple pleasure of being alive, to feel the sun on her face. Then, a voice broke the silence at the edge of her senses. "Rachel Cross." She perked up. "Drogon?" A moment's pause. Then, "I believe I require your aid in escaping this confounded furry prison." Chapter 35. "Hang in there, buddy," Jarek called, dubiously eyeing the gigantic furry leg they needed to move, or at least budge, to give Drogon a shot at crawling out of what Jarek figured was best referred to as Mada's furry armpit. Until we get the world's largest crane in here, he wanted to add. Somehow, it didn't seem like the most productive comment. He shifted his gaze to the mammoth's building-sized torso, looking for alternative options, and sighed. No strokes of brilliance. And much as he wanted to get Drogon out of there, the thought of trying to lift any part of the dead Kull was just making him feel even more exhausted than he already was. Elise, though, was having none of the idle waiting, which struck Jarek as curious until he remembered that it wasn't just Elise in there. It was also Lietha, who seemed to have something of a special bond with Drogon, as far as those things went, or didn't, with Ragnoth. It was going to take a little getting used to, this Enochian-Ragnoth hybrid thing. For now, though, he was just glad he wasn't the one having to do all the heavy lifting. Or any of it, hardly. Elise put her back into the effort with frightening strength. Halden raised his remaining hand, presumably to lend his own telekinetic aid. Jarek limped forward to add Phila's strength to the mix. Mada's leg felt like the kind of thing creatures their size simply had no business lifting. The Enochians lifted it all the same with a bit of help from Jarek. Or shifted it, at least. Not far, but far enough. When Drogon was finally able to claw his way out from the furry prison between Mada's leg and body, they gratefully let the leg shift back to its original position. Drogon rose to his feet with the utmost dignity, straightening out his clothes and trying for all the world to look as if nothing of note had just happened. Almost as if he was embarrassed. Something like it, at least. One of his arms was hanging oddly. Drogon frowned at it and was reaching for the shoulder with his good hand when Elise, or probably more accurately, Lietha, reached out and touched his cheek. It was a small touch, gentle and quickly over, but Drogon's eyes pulsed brighter for it, and his embarrassment only seemed to grow. Then Elise gripped his shoulder and popped it back into place with a smooth, confident movement. Drogon just nodded his thanks, no sign of appreciable pain. Halden said nothing, but watched the interaction with a slight frown. That was probably fair enough. Ragnoth pain-killing techniques or no, Jarek couldn't imagine losing an arm would make anyone less irritable. Then again, Halden didn't seem too upset about the loss. He and Alton were pretty certain they could simply grow another. In the meanwhile, though, Halden's irritability and Drogon and Lietha's proximity colored the silence a tinge of awkward. "Thanks for the catch back there, Stumpy," Jarek said, trying to break it up. "Sorry we left you sniffing Mammoth Pit. I was worried you were... well..." He looked around at the destruction that littered the mountainside. The lack of survivors seemed to speak for itself. "It will take more than one fallen colossus to end me," Drogon said, though he looked a shade less confident than he sounded. "I only regret I was unable to finish the fight alongside the 6 of you." 6? Once again, it took Jarek a second thought to remember the Ragnoth riding in Halden and Elise's bellies. Definitely going to take a little getting used to. "It appears the merger was successful," Drogon continued, looking between Halden and Elise. "Short-term heart attacks aside," Rachel added. That might have been putting it mildly on both accounts, but especially on the former. Granted, before their little scare below, Jarek had expected the 2, or 4 rather, would be impressively strong upon waking. Powerful arcanists with the strength of Ragnoth at their disposal? How could they not be? But the 2 beings who stood before them now? Suffice it to say, the new Halden and Elise were more than a little bit intimidating. "Sorry for the scare back there," Halden said. "But the reboot was necessary for us to properly function together." He spoke slowly, as if he had to search deep within himself for the answers. "We're going to need time to fully understand the extent of our abilities." "Fortunately," Elise added, "it appears that time is exactly what we have won today. Yeah, Jarek said. Call me crazy, but are we really so sure it's time to breathe easy and go back to our happy little lives? He knew Naga had telepathically said something to the effect that he wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. Rachel had hurriedly explained that much to him, but they'd been in too much of a hurry to come free Drogon to delve into it more. Still, it didn't exactly sound like irrefutable proof of their safety. To go back to your lives? Halden said. Yes. To breathe easy? No. We don't believe Naga will return within the millennium. Certainly not within the century. But preparations must begin. This world must be rebuilt. There was something subtly unnerving about the way Halden kept using that word, we. At first, Jarek had thought he was simply referring to himself and Elise. Now, though, Jarek kind of wanted to ask what exactly was going on in there, existentially. But then, he also kind of didn't. Remind me again how we can be sure he wasn't lying, Jarek said. Or that you're not just misinterpreting? Not for the first time, Jarek wished he could have been privy to telepathic radio. It wasn't that he didn't trust Rachel and the Enochians. It was just frustrating, always flying blind in these situations. He did say they wouldn't return until our distant descendants had forgotten about all of this, Rachel said. Jarek looked around the group. What else did I miss? Rachel shrugged. Not too much. Mostly just a few lines about how we're nothing but stardust that'll imminently be returning to the void. So, dude basically ripped off dust in the wind and then ran off like an angsty little nihilist? Rachel considered that, then tipped her head with an expression that said, more or less, pretty much. Jarek tried to laugh, but it came out uneasy. Shit. Maybe that scaly a-hole knew what he was doing. Skip forward 2 generations and everyone's going to start saying we probably just sat out here smoking peyote and made all this up. Give it 50 years and we'll be ripe for invasion. We cannot let that happen, Elise growled with an intensity that made Jarek tense and almost take a step back. Yeah, all right, Jarek said, patting the air with his hands. Something told him Elise and Lietha were still working out who got the bigger half of the driver's seat. Off in the distance, several trucks were approaching now from the direction of the lot and the north portal, probably coming to look for survivors. And, Jarek sincerely hoped, to give him a goddamn drink. Maybe a cookie, too. I must tend to Zar Krogoth, Drogon said, staring up at the mountain ridge where a few soldiers had already arrived by lift to start looking for people to help. Judging by the way Krogoth's broken body was half strewn across the mountain beside Harga's mangled head, Jarek wasn't so sure Krogoth was one of those people anymore. But Drogon didn't seem to pay that fact much mind. He set off with Halden and Elise, bounding up the mountain in a series of long leaps. As the trucks pulled up by the wreckage near the south portal, and the troops began to unload, several of them heading their way, all the shit Jarek had barely realized he was holding at bay started falling on him in earnest. All the aches and pains, the fear and the fried nerves, all of their wounded and dead. Price. Jesus, Price! And everyone else who'd been out there with him. Alaric, Michael, Chambers, Johnny, and the other Enochians. He needed to know they were all okay. Or that they weren't. Needed to know right now. But somehow, more by the say of gravity and his exhausted body rather than his own free will, Jarek found himself sinking to the ground instead. Al, he groaned. Can you work your magic? Find out if...
Price is alive, sir,
Al said, speaking through Fila so Rachel could hear too. Relief spread through him, light and warm until it was somewhat marred by Al's next words.
It sounds as though he might be in quite poor shape, however. Fortunately, the others appear to have made it safely out of the south portal collapse as well.
Michael? Rachel asked.
Alive and well,
Al said.
I believe he and Agent Chambers are currently joining the relief effort.
Rachel nodded her thanks. Jarek tried to move, wanted to go see Price, to be useful. But he couldn't seem to convince his legs it was worth the trouble. Then Rachel sat beside him, and that was that. She leaned her head against his shoulder, wrapped her arm around his waist. It felt good. Tired and battered, and emotionally drained as he was, it felt better in that moment than anything he could seem to recall right just then. Could it really be over? He wasn't sure. Probably never would be. But for a little while, at least, he simply leaned into Rachel's warm side and allowed himself to hope. There were no cheers or jubilant dances that day. For the rest of the long afternoon, there was little but wary silence and weary wound-licking, both literal and metaphorical. Once he managed to get back to his feet, Jarek did what he could to help what remained of the complex do the same. It wasn't all bad news. Within the first hour, those who'd evacuated during the fight, and had apparently gotten the all-clear sign since, returned to help triage the wounded, tidy up the complex, and get to work on the considerable task of excavating the south portal. Scattered friends reunited. Order began to restore. Still, there were no cheers. Not with the gravity of their losses, and the not-so-distant threat still looming heavy in the air. There were, however, firm pats on the back, and a hell of a lot of them throughout the day. Much as he appreciated the sentiment, Jarek couldn't help but wish they'd stop. For one, because he couldn't remember the last time he'd been this battered and bruised. It had to be some kind of record. It hurt to move, to breathe. Hell, it hurt to even think about breathing. But then there was the other reason. The not-so-tiny voice in the back of his mind that had been insisting since Naga flew off that, gratifying as it had been to watch the giant space dragon turn tail after his posse had abandoned him, it was too good to be true. For now, though, all he could do was try to offer help where it was needed. Jarek was surprised to discover Krogoth and Brant were both still alive. They barely looked it. Both seemed a bit delirious, which was understandable enough given the number of puncture wounds Brant had sustained and the fact that Krogoth was missing a leg and had nearly had his torso torn in two above the waist. The rest of Krogoth's Rachnoth hadn't made it, nor had Nandola, which everyone seemed to loosely agree put Zack in charge of things within the complex. Thankfully, the bodies of the Rakul appeared to remain quite dead as well. They decided to burn them anyway, just to be sure. A large area was quickly cleared on one of the flatter sections near Mada's enormous body, and a healthy fire soon crackled through the piled brush and foliage, breathing plumes of dark smoke into the clear blue sky. Halden, Elise, and Drogon set to the task of hauling Ogren, Harga, and Gada onto the fire. It wasn't pretty, and Jarek, having been denied another small hit of the vitamin R from Drogon, and thus woefully unequipped to deal with heavy lifting, was more than happy to be left out of it. Those soldiers and civilians who were around to witness Halden and Elise floating the hairless lupine alien down the mountainside with telekinesis looked more than a little unsettled by the display, which was understandable given that Harga probably weighed a good 7,000 or 8,000 pounds. Jarek could practically hear their thoughts, especially those of the complex folk, no doubt wondering what fresh manner of monsters they had to thank for their continued existence. He wanted to sigh, but he was too tired. Even with the Rakul out of the picture, which he still wasn't totally convinced about, it would be a long, long journey back to anything resembling normal. And, while he was pretty sure there weren't even 10 total Rachnoth left alive on Earth at this point, he was also certain the world wasn't just about to start accepting them with open arms. Hell, even he was a bit afraid of Halden and Elise. He had no idea what they were capable of, what they'd even want to do next now that the Rakul were on the retreat. He'd be crazy for that not to make him slightly uneasy. but that was most certainly a problem for the future. "Why run?" Jarek asked Drogon quietly as they stood with Rachel, watching the flames lick their way across Harga's pale, slowly charring hide. "Fraga, Shimo, Vermaga, that other Kulbot." "Kul Prongar," Drogon provided. "Prongar, sure. The four of them and their big bad dragon." He looked over at Drogon, but the Rachnoth kept his eyes to the fire. "They could have finished us. Rach and I were about to collapse at the end there." Rachel bobbed her head in tired agreement. "And no discredit to you guys," he added toward Halden and Elise, who were back up on the mountain ridge with Krogoth, but might well still be hearing him anyway. "But I'm pretty sure the five of them could have had you too after that." He actually wasn't entirely sure about that, but the thought still bothered him. All he really knew right then was that his legs were shaky, his body heavy. The Rakul, aside from Mada, who was far too large to move and would have to be handled afterward, were all loaded to burn, with a couple men alternately stoking the fire. They were done, weren't they? Mind and body alike cried for rest, and Jarek was beyond ready to give it to them. Or would be, at least, if he could just set aside the doubts that refused to quiet in his mind. Drogon was silent for a long while, watching his once master's thick hide give slow way to the fire. "Were you afraid the first time we fought one another?" he finally asked. "No," Jarek said, a touch too quickly. Drogon finally peeled his eyes away from the flames to shoot him a knowing look. "No? And what about when you faced Zargolga in one-on-one combat?" Jarek swallowed, resisting the urge to touch the 3 long scars Golga had left on his face as a souvenir. "What's your point?" "I imagine it was a forgotten novelty to you, feeling true fear in the midst of combat. Such had always been your supremacy with this." He tapped meaningfully on Fila's gouged chest plate. Jarek shrugged, unsure what to say. "Imagine it had not been 10 years of such supremacy," Drogon continued, "but 10,000. With the exception of Gada's ascension to Kul 3 millennia past, this is what the Rakul have known. Even longer for Naga and a few others. Can you imagine what it might feel like to watch not 1, but 7 of those indestructible kin meet their ends? To come to the realization that you might shortly share their fate?" Drogon dropped his intense gaze and turned back to the fire. "Do you honestly believe you would not have thought to flee, were you in their position?" Jarek let Drogon's words soak in. He glanced at Rachel, who appeared lost in her own thoughts. Finally, he shook his head in surrender. "I don't know." It was too big a question. He was too tired to think it through, and maybe not quite arrogant enough anyway to presume to actually know how he might feel about such things after several thousand years of life and toil. Drogon seemed to appreciate his uncertainty. "Nor do I, truly. But I do believe we gave the Rakul a strong taste of something they'd forgotten existed. Mortality. And they will not return until they are certain they may do so without risking another taste. That much I believe." Maybe it was Drogon's conviction, or maybe Jarek was just tired and desperate to believe too. But somehow, Drogon's words brought a quantum of peace to his thoughts. Finally, when Al's pleas for Jarek to take care of himself were on the verge of growing violent, Jarek gave in and turned away from the burning Rakul. Rachel, as she had since Naga had taken to the whirlwind engines he called wings, stayed with him, her staff plunking along on the dusty rocks. Zack and a few of his men pulled up with Alaric, Michael, and Chambers just as they reached the battered road that wrapped around the mountain to the lot and the north portal. "You look like you could use a ride," Alaric said. "And a nap," Michael added, coming forward to wrap Rachel in a hug and pat Jarek on the shoulder. Chambers took in their dirty faces with a light grimace.
And some medical attention, maybe. Hear, hear,
Al chimed from Fila's speakers. Zack surveyed the operations with a deep frown before finally looking at Jarek and Rachel. I don't know whether to curse you for bringing those things here, or to thank you for sending them away. Alaric spit in the dirt, and Jarek was actually happy to realize the older man was chewing, if only because it was some sign of Alaric's old self emerging. They'd have come here on their own eventually, Alaric said.
And I'd say the Rachnoth and our two newest superheroes over there deserve the brunt of the thanks,
Rachel added with a pointed look at Zack, like she knew she was telling a vegan to eat a bloody steak and she was too damn tired to care about it. Zack gave a non-committal grunt, started to shuffle off, and paused. Thank you, both of you. He looked up to where Johnny and Halden were standing together on the mountain ridge and shook his head. Them too, I guess. Jarek didn't bother pointing out that Zack should probably tell them himself. He was too tired, and the nearby truck looked too inviting. Why don't I take you guys back inside to get some food and rest, Michael said. Let me, Alaric said, already moving around toward the driver's seat. Michael shrugged, and he and Chambers bade them happy napping and went to go see how they could help. Alaric didn't speak until they were halfway back around the mountain. I'm not one to call a pony a horse, but it's possible you two might have saved the planet today.
Hardly, Rachel said. We were just doing our civic duty, really, Jarek said with a sleepy smile. She gave him a gentle jab in the ribs. I was gonna say dangling a big juicy target to keep them busy until everyone else could do the important stuff, like bring out the big gun, or rise from the dead with superpowers.
Ah, yeah, that too.
Alaric shook his head.
If you two split your egos and shared the average, I think you'd both be about right. They were apparently both too tired to come up with any response to that.
Jarek must have nodded off, because it seemed like next he knew they were pulling up outside the massive open door at the entrance to the complex. Rachel murmured a bleary thanks to Alaric and hopped out of the truck. Jarek did the same and was sliding his armored bulk through the slightly cramped space to follow her when Alaric twisted around and caught him by the forearm. Something heavy passed between them, though neither of them spoke for a long moment, and Jarek couldn't have said exactly what it was. You did good, son, Alaric finally said. He tilted his head after Rachel. Both of you. But the job's not done. Jarek gave a silent nod, his heart racing for some reason he couldn't quite put a finger on. Maybe it was the intensity in Alaric's eyes. Maybe it was simply the exhaustion. You rest up. God knows you've earned it. But when the dust starts to clear, we're still gonna need you. Both of you. We're gonna need leaders. And whether you like it or not, you and Rachel just pinned your pretty faces front and center on the banner of Team Earth. Jarek opened his mouth to argue, wanted to point out that he was about as qualified as a sack of frozen turds when it came to being any manner of leader. But he couldn't. The words wouldn't seem to come. For one, they wouldn't have been true. A shining example of commendable leadership he was not, and probably never would be. But after everything that had happened, he couldn't pretend he was incapable. Not to Alaric. Not when Jarek's taking the reins was exactly what had set them on the course to losing Seth. And then there was the other part of the equation. That tiny, naive fragment that still clung on from his teenage years. The one who'd wanted to save the world from itself. The one who'd been so audacious as to think he actually could. He'd learned his lessons. He'd spent a good decade trying to drown that nonsense in a steady stream of booze and blood, and night after night spent alone with Al in his self-inflicted exile. And now here he was, feeling those same audacious aspirations creeping in again. Was it really different this time? He was older, that was a given, But wiser? He shook his head. Man, I just wanted to get my damn suit back. Alaric tipped his head, the ghost of a smile on his lips. And I just wanted to put a stop to the Rachnoth taking our people and crops for their own all those years ago. But here we are. Yeah, well, if it's all the same to you, I think I'd rather here be swaddled in soft blankets on the other side of a solid meal right now. Alaric's smile grew by a fraction, and he gestured for Jarek to have on with it. Jarek paused halfway out of the truck door. I'm sorry you lost Seth, he said quietly. I'm sorry I couldn't stop it. Alaric nodded, his gaze falling. I know. Me too. Silence hung between them, mournful and weighty, but also companionable. Get some rest, Alaric said. Then get back on your feet. Plenty left that needs doing. Jarek gave a lazy salute and slid out of the truck. Yes, sir. Alaric only fixed him on the end of a surly stare for a few seconds before turning the truck around and heading back out. Inside, the complex was a bustle of activity. Men and women hurried to and fro with toolboxes and bundles of wire and such, attempting to repair the extensive damage wrought by Vermaga's inside men. Others were doing what they could to treat the wounded or transporting those who were beyond their abilities toward the medical wing. Still more just nervously hopped from one group to the next, swapping news with wide eyes. Several of those wide eyes fixed on Jarek and Rachel as they made their way to medical. 2 resistance soldiers stepped aside to clear the way for them. Then a small group of complex residents. Then, before Jarek knew it, the entire busy tunnel was parting before them. When Jarek's emphatic carry-on gestures failed, he and Rachel instead hurried through the proffered pathway post-haste. This is kind of freaking me out, Rachel murmured quietly, knowing he'd hear her anyway. He couldn't say he completely disagreed. Having been walking around in a one-of-a-kind exosuit for half his life, Jarek had gotten fairly used to being stared at. Rachel, who routinely walked around with what was basically a wizard's staff, and was far from being hard on the eyes to boot, had probably done the same. But this was different. They weren't just stealing glances at the freaky weirdos. They looked, he didn't know what. Grateful, maybe? In awe? Whatever it was, it felt weird, and he was glad when they reached the medical ward. Glad, at least, until one of the medics led them to Price. Even at his best, the old man had never exactly looked sturdy, but now he looked so fragile, lying there on the cot. His face was scraped and bruised, and while he appeared to be asleep or unconscious, something about his resting pallor and pained expression gave Jarek the feeling that the damage extended well below the surface. How could it not, after having been hammered in the torso by a cull? How bad is it? Jarek asked the medic who'd led them in, keeping his voice low. The slight wince on her face gave him half his answer before she spoke. We're optimistic he'll pull through, but it's not good. Most of the ribs on his right side are broken, one of them punctured the lung, and his heart nearly gave out. Her wince deepened. We're also concerned there may be some spinal cord damage, but it's too early to tell. We're not equipped for that kind of thing, but we'll do our best. Jarek couldn't seem to do anything but stare. Rachel took his hand and squeezed. He's one tough old guy, the medic added. It'll be okay. Best to let him rest for now, though. At Rachel's light pressure, Jarek finally started to turn away. But then Price groaned and cracked an eye open. Jarek... Jarek dropped to a knee beside the cot and gently pressed the hand Price was trying to raise back to his side. It's okay, Price. I'm right here. Price rattled a few breaths, face scrunched in pain, clearly trying to say something. When? He rasped out. You bet your wrinkly ass we did, Jarek said, trying to hold a smile.
Thanks to our resident tinkerer blowing a few coal heads off, I might add. You did good out there, you old goat. Price just closed his eye, looking a touch more at peace, and nodded back to sleep. After that, things were blurry. They found some food, forced it down. Jarrett couldn't have said 2 minutes later what he'd just eaten. He was too busy limping through the tunnels for his and Rachel's little broom closet bedroom, and the blissful promise of cool, quiet peace. He collapsed into their meager pile of blankets with Rachel. The floor was hard, the blankets musty. He pulled Rachel to him. The complex safe, Price alive, the Rakul gone. In the darkness, Rachel began to laugh, the kind of laugh that started out almost sounding as if she were crying. But the laugh grew, and soon her body was shaking with it. There was a moment of concern, a moment of wondering what the hell was so funny, and whether or not she might have cracked. But then he was laughing too, not really understanding why, not particularly caring that each laugh set half his body to aching pains, some sharp, others lingering. He just pulled her closer, their bodies silently shaking together now, and decided it was the most content he'd ever been. After that, sleep came swiftly. Some indeterminate time later, Jarek woke with a start, expecting blaring alarms and gleaming fangs and roaring dragons. All he saw was the dim shape of Rachel, her chin resting on his chest, gazing up at him. He groaned at the pain his waking body greeted him with, and reached to find her cheek with his hand. The single light flicked on above them, Rachel's telekinetic doing, he assumed, and he gladly took in the sight of her lovely hazel eyes. There was something in them, a kind of softness he wasn't accustomed to seeing. It halted the flippant greeting working its way to the edge of his sleepy tongue. "I do, you know," she said softly. He didn't immediately grasp what she was talking about. When it hit him, though, he couldn't keep his face from pulling into a big, stupid smile. A really big one, judging by the pain it drew from his bruised face and cracked lips. Okay, she said. "Let's not get carried away. It looks like your face is going to split in half. You love me." She watched him levelly, her mouth seeming to war between trying to deny it and breaking into a smile. "You're totally in love with a grown-ass man-child." "I will kill you," she muttered, but the threat somehow lost steam when she crawled up and planted a warm kiss on his lips. "So what's next?" Jarek asked when she pulled back. "Gonna try to whisk me away from this wild life? Make an honest wife of me?" "I feel like we might be mixing our lines here." She laid her head down on his shoulder. "And forgetting about certain realities out there. Hey, a bet's a bet, Goldilocks. 2 whole months. Them's the rules. The rest of the world can wait. Probably gonna take me that long to be able to walk straight anyway." "Is this the part where I'm supposed to say it'll be 3 months after I'm through with you?" He chuckled. "Only if you want to exacerbate the current lack of blood in my vital organs." Her lips tickled his shoulder as she smiled. "Al?" he asked.
"Yes, sir?"
came Al's response from Fila's speakers in the corner. "Be a dear and find us a nice cabin somewhere." He thought about it. "Maybe by a lake." Not that Al had a mouth, but Jarrett could have sworn he heard the pleased smile in his friend's voice.
"Of course, sir. I'll do my best."
2 whole months, Rachel murmured into his shoulder. They're just gonna love that. Somehow, after everything he and Rachel had laid down for the planet since first joining the Resistance, Jarek didn't think anyone would begrudge it of them too much now that the sky wasn't actively falling. They had a lot of work to do in the coming years, an entire world to rebuild. One day, the Rakul would return. And one day far sooner than that, Jarek and Rachel would probably both be called upon to help their planet prepare. But for now, it kind of felt like they had all the time in the world. Epilogue. "We're gonna be late," Rachel said, glancing down at her comm. "Again." Jarek straightened from checking the oven window and made a point of straightening out the ridiculous kiss the cook apron he was wearing. "You can't rush art, Goldilocks. And I'm still not sure what this late thing is that you speak of. Back in my day." She couldn't help but smile a little as Jarek launched into yet another tirade about his long years living by the sword and the absurdity of a life so luxurious and cozy that you could actually be expected to arrive at a place on time without being set upon by savage marauders or red-eyed aliens. Back in his day. Like they hadn't been through it all together. Like it hadn't only been 6 months ago. It was a familiar monologue, though he always varied the flavor just for kicks. And despite the fact that everyone would already be at prices by now, she had a hard time getting too irritated by his lack of punctuality when he was clearly in such high spirits. Plus, in his defense, it did still feel kind of weird, casually planning a party night without a care in the world barely more than 10 miles from the spot the Rakul invasion had officially kicked off in force just over 7 months ago. Al, as he often did, picked an opportune moment and dove into the rant alongside Jarek, seeming to feel similarly about seeing Jarek enthused about something other than sex, whiskey, and scrappy violence. Not that she minded all of the above, and not that he left them behind either. Just last week, they'd lost half of their back deck and a good chunk of the northeastern corner of their house when Jarek and Drogon's weekly sparring match had gotten a bit out of hand. Drogon had given awkward but courteous apologies. Jarek, still lying in the pile of rubble, had just panted something or another about the importance of staying sharp. Thinking about the incident, she started tapping her fingernails impatiently on the countertop. "And how long until said art is complete, Picasso?" She actually felt bad when he absent-mindedly traced the lines of the scars on his face, forming a connection she hadn't meant to imply. They could laugh and joke all they wanted, and for the most part they did. But the reminders of everything they'd been through, and the toll it had all taken, continued to pop up in the little details here and there, often when they least expected it. Before she could go to him and assure him that she wouldn't have his face any other way, Jarek's thoughtful expression passed and his smile returned. "Couple minutes? So probably just enough time for a," she skewered him with her best, "we're not having a quickie while we keep our friends waiting for your baked goods look." "Kitchen dance party?" he concluded, gauging her reaction. In the corner of the kitchen, Al's speaker began pumping a bass-heavy rhythm without missing a beat. "Why?" Jarek asked, wagging his eyebrows. "What'd you think I was talking about?" She resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She still wasn't sure what it was with him and this sudden obsession with baking. Something about his having lived without an oven and mostly off of canned goods, wild vegetables, and the odd bit of game here and there for nearly a decade. Guy went nuts for a loaf of fresh-baked bread. But the baking seemed to be therapeutic for him, and the regular stream of baked goods was definitely therapeutic for her as well, so there wasn't really any reason to complain. Still, she couldn't just let him off the hook that easily. So she walked closer, adding an unnecessary sway to her hips. She always felt silly walking like that, but she never got tired of his reaction. The excited intake of breath, the tight grip on the counter, like he was straining to keep himself from tackling her to the floor and attacking her clothes. She drew in close, up on her tiptoes, until her lips brushed lightly against his ear. She felt the tension in his body, every fiber of him threatening to rebel against his control, pounce on her. Gently, as sultrily as she could, she whispered, "I thought you were talking about fucking me until I forget we're late." She couldn't help but grin as he gave a little gasp, and his hand slipped from the countertop. He swallowed audibly, forced a shrug, and tilted his head at the batter-smeared mixing bowl. Yeah, well, I've got, very important baking stuff to do, so, She leaned closer, selling it until she felt her own genuine tingles of excitement building. He started to slide his arms around her waist, slowly, like he was hoping she somehow might not notice. She reminded herself that this was supposed to be the part where she left him hanging and got him back for his little dance party joke. They really shouldn't right now. She should back away, but... He pulled her tight and kissed her hungrily. Tingles intensified. She gasped for breath, cupped a hand on the back of his neck, and... Ding! The chime of the oven timer hit her like a splash of cold water. Jarek groaned and jabbed the button to kill the oven's coils. He turned back to her, clearly intending to pick up where they'd left off. She caught his advance with a hand to his aproned chest and gave him a measuring look. Don't you have important baking stuff to do? He just grinned and pounced on her. Or tried to. She caught him with telekinesis this time, pecked a quick kiss on his nose, and backed away until the kitchen island was safely between them. Pack the goodies and let's go. Maybe later, if you're real good. Jarek tilted his head questioningly. Is this about the corner of the house still? Because that was totally Stumpy's fault. Uh-huh. Explains why I found you both in the rubble. Well, yeah, Jarek said, slipping on a big red crab-claw oven mitt and pulling the oven door open. I mean, he broke it with my face, but it was still him doing the breaking. Rachel took an appreciative whiff of the thick scent of chocolate filling the kitchen. Seems kinda like a matter of perspective. Yeah, he said, setting the sizable cake pan on the stovetop to cool. Tell that to my face. She smiled and ran her fingers over the cool granite of the island countertop, while Jarek busied himself covering their cake in some manner of dark frosting. She glanced at her comm and was unsurprised to see it free of messages. No one checking where they were. Likely, everyone already had a fair idea. It was kind of funny, the ways people could change from one set of circumstances to the next. When the heat was on, no one else got shit done like Jarek Slater. Remove said heat and plop him down in New World suburbia, and he became perpetually late and started baking cakes and talking about back in his day like a rambling old man. Somehow, it only made her love him more. There were still times, and plenty of them, when she couldn't quite believe she'd stumbled so completely into this, whatever this was. Times where she felt almost as if she somehow betrayed some quintessential part of the person she was, or the person she'd been, at least. Sure, after she'd lost her parents, she'd had Michael and John. She'd had familial love. But somewhere deep down, she'd never really been able to stop thinking of herself as anything but a lone wolf. She'd never expected to be anything but the cold survivor who'd never be able to give herself to another person completely enough to risk being hurt again. Sometimes, she still felt like she could never truly be anything but that person. But then Jarek would pull her to him with this resolute certainty, like she belonged there, like he'd left a piece of himself inside her and needed to touch base with it. And those thoughts would grow quiet, overruled by tender emotions she'd never really expected to have, yet somehow couldn't imagine being without now. Apparently, all it had ever taken to soften those walls of hers had been fighting the Rachnoth, uniting the planet, and surviving the Rakul, all side by side with a certain special someone. Simple. Nothing to it, really. And even now, it wasn't like this thing between them was some kind of storybook happily ever after. They fought, though said fights ended with both of them laughing at themselves as often as not. So maybe it was happily ever after. Their version of it, at least. She couldn't say for sure. All she knew was that their fires burned well together. That was the best way she could think to put it. Most days, she was happier than she'd ever really expected she would be. It was more than she'd ever bothered to ask for. Frosting for your thoughts, milady? Rachel came back from her musings and found Jarek holding out a chocolate glaze-laden spatula for her to lick. Double chocolate, huh? She said, teetering between telling him to forget the spatula and hurry it up and tearing said spatula from his hand and devouring that glistening chocolate delight. Oh ho ho, no, my sexy little concubine. I went full-on triple chocolate up in this bitch. Before she could formulate a reply, something shimmered at the far reaches of her senses, drawing her focus. Not really sure where we get off calling it triple chocolate, Jarek continued, waving the spatula in front of her face. She was too busy pulling up her mental defenses and warily inspecting the group of blazing mental presences that were quickly approaching outside. I mean, I guess it sounds more snazzy than shit ton of chocolate in your chocolate, Jarek was saying somewhere far away. You sure you don't want to? Jarek. He froze at her tone, all playfulness forgotten. What is it? Halden and Elise, they're here. A glob of chocolate dripped to the countertop from the extended spatula. Jarek's serious expression slowly shifted to one of surprised thoughtfulness. Oh. Do you think they want to lick? Rachel snorted. Nothing against your goods, but I'm guessing they're not here for triple chocolate cake. What they actually were here for, she had no idea. As far as she knew, no one had seen the pair for months now. The last she'd seen them had been when they'd swung by her and Jarek's cabin retreat after Cheyenne. That had been toward the end of the third week of their proposed 2 whole months of cabin recovery time. And, as deeply enjoyable as those 3 weeks of complete privacy had been, the Enochian's visit had also broken the spell and marked the day when both her and Jarek had ceased being able to justify weighing their own blissful recovery against their growing concerns for the fledgling New World Order. So they'd headed back out to rejoin the rest of the world right after Halden and Elise had departed to do the polar opposite. The rest of the Enochians had visited the pair somewhere in the Himalayas a few times since then, but all Rachel really knew was that Halden and Elise, and of course Alton and Lietha too, had felt they had some serious shit to sort out with their new existences, and that they thought it best they do it in relative isolation. Jarek tossed the spatula in the sink and wiped his hands with a towel. What if they want us to do stuff? We could probably stand to do some stuff. Jarek wagged his eyebrows and started to open his mouth. Other stuff, she said with a grin, before he could go for the low-hanging fruit. God, seems like a whole big thing. Don't act like you're not dying for some action. Plus, they can probably hear us right now. We can. We can. We can, came Halden, Alton's, and Lietha's voices all at once. Just a bit, Elise added. And I actually wouldn't mind that lick. What is it? Jarek asked, studying Rachel's face. A grin broke across his mouth. They want cake, don't they? Rachel just gave an exasperated sigh. Come on in, boys and girls, Jarek called. Halden and Elise weren't long in reaching the front door. Surprised as she'd been to feel Halden and Elise, Rachel hadn't noticed Drogon was with them until he walked in and closed the door behind them. But her attention was more focused on the 2 beings in front of him. The Enochians had changed. Again. It was far more subtle than their initial transformation, but they looked harder, stronger. Halden had finished regrowing his left arm. But there was something else, too. Something about their expressions and the way they moved. Somehow they looked both more alien and yet more themselves than they had before. It was odd. Apparently, Jarek was less flabbergasted than her, or at least better at hiding it. Well, I'll be, he said. The mountain hermits return in search of epic triple chocolate cake. Nice arm, by the way. They smiled, and it only highlighted the change in them. Where before, it had seemed like they'd merged both body and mind with Alton and Lietha, now it seemed more like they were their old selves, merely walking around in vastly more powerful bodies with a pair of Rachnoth comrades in tow. Thanks, Halden said, waving his regrown arm demonstratively. But I'm afraid it's a happy coincidence on the cake thing. A happy coincidence we'll gladly embrace, though, Elise added, after deeply inhaling the rich sweetness in the air. Jarek turned to grab plates and paused. You guys want to come to Price's? We were just about to head over. Whole gang's gonna be there. We actually just came from there, Elise said. We were hoping to catch everyone together, Haldon said, a small grin pulling across his mouth. But apparently some have more trouble with punctuality than others. Yeah, military boy, Jarek said, starting to slide plates from a cupboard. Cake now, then? No one argued. Rachel finally got over her surprise and found her tongue as she gestured for their guests to join her on the island stools. So what have you guys been up to? Not that much, honestly, Haldon said, sliding onto the stool across from her. He frowned as it groaned a little under his deceptively heavy frame, but it held. An aggressive amount of not that much, Elise agreed, seating herself beside Rachel. Lots of thinking and talking. It's pretty weird, having to discover your own body again. As she talked, Drogon walked over to join Jarek in the kitchen and reached a finger out to skim a taste off the top of the waiting cake. Jarek slapped his hand. They traded stares that were playful, but still dangerously challenging. Rachel cleared her throat and pointedly turned her eyes in the direction of the damage they'd caused last week. This time, the look they traded was one of two kids who'd just been caught playing after bedtime. Jarek went back to doling out cake for their guests. Drogon grabbed forks and carried the loaded plates over. What about you guys? Elise asked, smiling at the little display. The Senate keeping you busy? Jarek barked a laugh. Ha! They'd have to make their minds up about something before they could do that. Much as she wanted to point out for the millionth time that the slow going was understandable given the circumstances, Rachel couldn't completely disagree with the heart of the sentiment. It hadn't taken long after leaving their little cabin retreat months ago to realize that their services, as it turned out, weren't so readily helpful. But then again, no one else's seemed to be right now either. It was a question of application. The world was in an odd kind of pre-Golden Age flux right now, with everyone ready and willing to dive in, but no one really seeming to know how or where to start. Like a bunch of kids let loose in the world's largest candy store. Mostly, their efforts so far had fallen by default to rebuilding infrastructure and trying to get a proper assessment of just how badly the planet had fared through the Rakul invasion, not to mention the 15 years preceding it. Even before the Rakul, when they'd still had passable net coverage, the presence of the Rachnoth and the harsh pressures of the catastrophe's aftermath had thoroughly discouraged the formation of anything beyond the scope of homesteads and tiny villages. Maybe they'd trade here and there. Maybe not. Places like Newark had basically been death traps, and places like Unity had been few and far between. All in all, it had been pretty hard to accurately gauge how Earth was doing. And after the net came down, hard became impossible. To that end, restoring the net as globally as they could had been one of the only truly clear focuses off the bat. They needed to know how much devastation the Rakul had wrought during their month-long occupation, and they needed to communicate with the rest of the world. Once that had started coming together, the Senate had seemed like the natural next step. A worldwide coalition of all sorts from all places, all on board for a better tomorrow. One where they, or their descendants at least, were strong enough to handle whatever intergalactic threats might come their way. Just because everyone was on board, however, didn't necessarily mean the ship was going to magically start moving. It had been like pulling teeth, especially when they'd brought in Krogoth, Brant, and Drogon, and proposed to officially declare the few remaining Rachnoth of Earth as friends and allies of the planet. Neither Rachel nor Jarek relished their time spent in Senate conferences, but it was important, she would remind them both. It was arduous and irritating, and sometimes it made her want to blast a hole through the wall, but getting the planet on one page, even a slightly jumbled one, was crucial to their long-term survival as a species. With the infrastructure steadily strengthening and the threats to life in cropland severely reduced, they'd at least managed to agree on a few things already. Everyone, for instance, was being encouraged to begin repopulating. On a planet full of people who'd spent 15 years mostly in fear and more recently escaped from the jaws of certain death by Rakul, feverish doses of getting busy wasn't such a hard sell. It seemed plenty of folks got started on their own with that one, several of their friends included. Johnny and Leah, for one, were now publicly shacking up together. Michael and Chambers, to Rachel's decidedly satisfied approval, had recently done the same. No, enjoying their survival to the fullest came naturally enough. It was convincing everyone it was actually safe to bring children into the world that was taking a bit more doing. "There's a lot of work to do," Rachel said, coming back to the conversation. A woeful understatement. Jarek came up behind her and Drogon and clapped a hand to each of their shoulders. "But we'll just keep on beating up marauders and keeping the peace while the world crawls back together. At least until Rach gets her new Jedi Academy up and running." Halden and Elise both turned to her with newfound interest. "An academy?" Elise asked. "That's very much in the air right now," she said, frowning at Jarek. "They put out the call for anyone with arcane talents. We've had a few step forward. I'm not really holding my breath for many more. Still not sure how it's all going to play out, but the Senate wants me to teach them to fight and enchant weapons and so forth." For some reason, that made Halden and Elise exchange a knowing smile. "You'll do an amazing job, Rachel," Halden said. Elise nodded her confident agreement. "And what will you two do, exactly?" Jarek asked. Something in his tone had changed, like he'd just confirmed something sad to be true. Halden frowned down at the dark crumbs on his plate. "We're growing stronger," Halden said. He didn't sound excited about it. "We're worried," Elise added. "About a lot of things." Her hand drifted to her abdomen, presumably where Lietha had taken up residence. "All four of us." "You want me and Drogon to suit up and smack you around a bit?" Jarek asked. "Remind you what it feels like?" Halden smiled. "Guess there'd be a certain poetry in that, considering how we first met back in the Woods of Unity." A soft sadness drifted over Rachel as it dawned on her what Jarek had realized. "I think the poetry would be if you'd come here to say goodbye." They said nothing. "You came here to say goodbye, didn't you?" They both looked, not quite guilty, just regretful, their smiles wan. "Why?" Rachel asked. "In short," Halden held up his and Elise's interlocked hands from underneath the cover of the island. "Because these hands, lovely as they are," he added with a sidelong glance to Elise, "were made for fighting, not for peace." Rachel frowned at said hands, not really sure what to say. Finally, she went with, "That's a bit melodramatic, don't you think?" "Yeah," Jarek added. "Seriously, you could probably plow the shit out of a field with those bad boys." For a moment, the Enochian's smiles turned to true amusement. Halden even chuckled. But then that sadness crept back in. They'd already made their minds up. That much was clear. "What will you do?" Rachel asked. "Well," Halden started, looking at Elise. "We were thinking we might go dragon hunting," Elise said. "Ah," Jarek murmured. Silence hung in the kitchen for a stretch before he continued. "Shit. Yup, that's a big one." Rachel didn't know what to say. She didn't want to see the Enochians just up and leave. For one, the two were by far their strongest defense should Naga and the rest of the Kull decide to get brave and return sooner than later. But more than that, they were their friends. "What about the others?" Rachel asked. "Johnny and Franco? Phineas? James?" Real pain crept over both the Enochians' faces.
We've all decided it's best if they stay here, Halden said. For now, at least. They can help this planet, Elise said, wiping at what might have been an itch, but Rachel suspected was the beginning of a tear. Teach you lessons from Enokia? And we're not really sure what we're getting into out there anyway. Might not be any place for mortal humans to go flying blindly into. Shit, Jarek repeated. Shit, Rachel agreed. When? Halden looked back down at his empty plate. Guess our last meal was cake. We could do worse, Elise said, nudging him in the ribs. They stood with a heavy finality. Stumpy? Jarek said as Drogon turned to follow them. I will remain on Earth, Drogon said, though his eyes didn't leave Elise. For now. Oh, thank God, Jarek sighed, patting at his chest. No one wants to see a grown man cry right now. Rachel was a little surprised to find how much the news relieved her as well. A somber silence seemed to follow them like a living thing as they padded out of the house with the Enochians. They said their last farewells on the front porch, in the fading light of the setting sun. As sad as it was to be saying goodbye, Rachel had a feeling it was nothing compared to what was going on in Drogon's head. The Rachnoth stood close to Elise, looking like he wanted to touch her, but was too stubborn to do so. Rachel could feel the telepathic flow between him and Lietha inside of Elise. Then Elise's eyes went distant for a moment, and when she returned, Rachel got the impression Elise had ceded the driver's seat over to her internal companion. Elise, or Lietha, leaned forward and pressed her forehead to Drogon's. Drogon didn't hug her, was probably convincing himself at that very moment that such gestures were too foolishly human for him to indulge in. But he did close his eyes and take a long, deep breath, as if absorbing every detail of her presence. Behind them, Halden was pointedly looking out at the open sky, clearly trying to give them their moment. We'll meet again, Al Drogon, Elise said, when they parted, laying a hand on his shoulder in a way that made Rachel think it was indeed Elise in control once more. God damn it, it was sad to watch. You know, Jarek said when they were all set to leave, I don't think I ever actually thanked you two, you four, I mean, for saving our asses. Halden waved off his thanks. I doubt we did anything you wouldn't have. Besides, in the grand scheme of things, this has always been one long effort to keep our own planet safe. The path's just turning out to be a bit longer than expected. And maybe you'll have your chance to repay us someday anyway, Elise added with a wan smile. You'll know where to find us, Jarek said. The Enochians nodded and turned to leave. They watched them go from the top of the porch steps, not speaking, each wrapped up in their own thoughts. Rachel could only assume there was at least part of Drogon wishing he'd been the one to merge with Halden in place of Alton Parker. It would have been perfect. Two lovers playing host to two Rachnoth who clearly shared some strong affinity for one another, whatever they wanted to call it. But life was a real bitch sometimes. She reached over and gave Drogon a comforting pat on the back, a gesture that would have been inconceivable less than a year ago. So what do we do now? She finally asked once the Enochians had boarded their ship and long since disappeared in the distance. Drinks at prices, Jarek said. Many, many drinks at prices. For once, that plan didn't sound half bad. As she turned to go grab their stuff with Jarek, though, Drogon caught her wrist. He cocked his head, sniffed the air. She watched him uncertainly, an odd feeling swirling in her stomach. Drogon almost never touched her. But now he was leaning in closer, sniffing again. He looked meaningfully down at her belly before meeting her eyes. Her stomach turned a loop through her chest. Alcohol may be unwise. Drogon's words hit her like a throat punch.
She tried to swallow, to breathe. Her mouth suddenly seemed too dry for either. What? Jarek asked the question screaming through her mind on repeat. He was watching them from the doorway with a confused expression. She couldn't worry about that now, though. She was too busy plunging her senses inward, searching with frantic desperation for the flicker she was suddenly sure she'd find. She'd been due in a few days. Was it possible? I must have missed it under the cover of all the chocolate inside, but Drogon sniffed the air again, checking to be certain. He needn't have checked. There. She felt it there, right at the center of her. The tiniest flicker of life that was both part of her but also somehow distinct of its own. Oh my God, she heard herself murmur. The world spun around her. Drogon caught her before she even processed her knees had buckled. Her vision reoriented. Jarek was hovering above them, mouth agape, more stunned than she'd ever seen him. She's, he stammered. Is she, are you? She nodded weakly up at him, waiting for the realization to strike him, for his eyes to widen in horror as he turned tail and ran for it. He just stood there, mouth agape. Then he dropped to his knees and pulled her to him, taking her weight from Drogon's arms. He was gasping, with laughs or sobs she couldn't really tell. He was squeezing her too hard. She squeezed back, too shocked to do anything else. Drogon, deciding his job was done, began to pull away to leave them to it. Jarek caught him by the front of his long coat and tugged him back down. No way, Stumpy, Jarek said, his voice thick. This here's a family group hug moment. Drogon looked mildly alarmed. I would prefer to let... Oh, just hug us, you scaly a-hole, Jarek said, pulling him in. With painstaking awkwardness, Drogon looped his arms around the two of them, somehow managing to barely touch either of them in the process until he gave them each a pair of uncertain pats on their backs. There we go, Jarek said. One big happy family. I mean, kid's gonna need a godfather, right? Rachel and Drogon both recoiled at that. Kidding, kidding! Drogon retreated to the house with a grumpy huff after that. Rachel and Jarek remained wrapped in each other's arms for some time. Her head was still reeling with the implications, which seemed to mushroom more and more extensively the more she thought about it. Jarek held her all the while, his arms firm and wonderfully warm. You're not scared? Rachel finally asked. Are you kidding me? He asked through a chuckle. I think I'm having a heart attack right now. But I don't know. This feels right, I guess. A playful note crept into his tone. I mean, if I have to be chained down to one person for the rest of my life. She wiped away brimming tears and leaned back to take in his warm smile. Such a way with words, she muttered, though she couldn't help but meet his smile. Her mood soon sobered, though. And this doesn't mean... I mean, you're not... What? Stuck? Obligated? Was that really how she thought of herself? As an obligation? And what if I want to be? He whispered, before she could decide, his eyes radiating tender care. I don't want anything else, Rachel. I just want... She kissed him, and for a long while, they stayed there like that, tucked into each other against the growing chill of the evening. Finally, when darkness had fallen, and the buzzing of both their comms was becoming too frequent to ignore, they gathered themselves and stood. Drogon joined them on the porch, triple chocolate cake in tow, and together they set off for Price's in the gathering darkness, ready to share their own little light with their new family. The end. Dear reader, A letter from the author, read by your wonderful narrator, Stephen Barnett. He made me say that, I swear. Oh boy, where to start? Well, I guess with the fact that this book, and the Harvesters series as a whole, has indeed reached its intended end. And if that realization conjures in you a sudden and urgent need to reach for a tissue, rest assured, you're not alone. It probably won't surprise you to hear we've grown quite fond of this series ourselves. Go figure, right? But hey, it's Luke's first, and holy hoppin' mountain goats, did he have a fun time writing it, and I had a fun time reading it. The world we've fumbled through building, the delightfully strong and cheeky characters we've discovered along the way. It's been a hell of a ride, and I don't want to say goodbye. Neither does Luke. So he might not. Not yet, at least. Exactly how he may, or may not, revisit Rachel and Jarek and their scrappy little crew in the future remains to be seen. He's got ideas. Big ones. But nothing's set in stone yet. Or, even in Jell-O. What I can tell you is that this universe is not yet closed for business. In fact, the next trilogy is already here. It's called the Enochian War Trilogy, and it features, yep, you guessed it, the Enochians. More specifically, the trilogy chronicles the epic journey Halden, Elise, and Johnny went through to save their own planet from Rachnoth invasion, and explains how they ended up on Earth. If you enjoyed this series, we're pretty sure you're gonna dig it. Better yet, it's already available on Amazon. Search for Shadows of Divinity to find the first book and prepare for a whole new adventure. We hope we'll see you on the other side. Before you go, though, we do want to give you something. One last sopping wet thank you. Here goes. Thank you, dear reader, for listening to this audiobook and to all the others before it. However you found our work, we're immensely glad that you did. We hope it's brought you hours of entertainment and smiles. Because without you, dear reader, well, this would all be kind of silly, wouldn't it? So thank you, truly. Love and peace, Luke R. Mitchell and Stephen Barnett. This has been Retribution, a paranormal sci-fi adventure, the Harvesters series, Book 4. Written by Luke R. Mitchell. Narrated by Stephen Barnett. Copyright 2018 by Luke R. Mitchell. Production copyright 2020 by Luke R. Mitchell.